Did you ever wonder what would have happened if Aokiji became the Fleet Admiral? Or what if Luffy awakened Gear 5 during Marineford? Or even better, what if Luffy became a Marine? Well, in this video, I'll cover all of these plus many more insane what-if scenarios that will definitely blow your mind. For example, if Aokiji defeated Akainu, many important world events would completely change. And there are only two ways the story could go from here. With Aokiji as Fleet Admiral, the first thing he would do is appoint Garp as his closest ally. I think this is likely to happen because they share similar views on justice, and Garp was the one who trained Aokiji when he joined the Marines. Next, just as Aokiji left in the original story, I think Akainu would leave Marines in this version. Aokiji and Akainu are two sides of the same coin. They both want justice but have completely different ways of achieving it, and therefore, I don't think either one could stand serving under the other. Of course, I don't think Akainu would join Blackbeard pirates like Aokiji did. He would instead probably create a small alliance of his own and fight the pirates, similar to what Zephyr did in Film Z. Okay, with Akainu leaving and Aokiji in charge, the things in One Piece world are bound to get better, right? Right? Well, not so much. The thing about the world government and how it operates is that the Fleet Admiral doesn't have the freedom to make any change they want. It's also important to remember that they report directly to the 5 elders, and no matter how good their intentions are, they can't do anything major without their approval. If Aokiji really wanted to make a change, he would need to trick them by doing what they asked him to do, but making secret plans with his trusted team in the shadows. This team would consist of Marines who share his ideals and moral compass. Some people that come to mind are Garp, Smoker, Tashigi, Kobe, Helmeppo, Hina, and maybe even Fujitora. Aokiji would directly command this group, sending them undercover on the islands to stop dangerous criminals that the world government doesn't care about. One of the main criminals they would go after is Doflamingo, and they would probably manage to get rid of him even before Luffy comes to Dressrosa. This all sounds pretty good, but there is a much darker path this scenario can take. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. One thing that I want to remind you of is that many important people from the world government, maybe even some celestial dragons, wanted Akainu to be in charge. This is possibly because he follows the absolute justice and would be easier to control. Whatever the case, I don't think these powerful people would just watch Aokiji become a Fleet Admiral and jeopardize the government. This is why they would most likely try to kill and replace him with someone they can trust. If they would actually manage to do something like this isn't really clear, but if someone dangerous like Kong, 5 Elders, or even Emu liked this plan, it shouldn't be too hard to permanently get rid of Aokiji. If this actually happened, it would be really bad, as not only would the Marines be run by someone evil, but one of the good guys would also be dead. I definitely wouldn't want this scenario to happen. There are still 14 more insane what-if scenarios I'll cover in this video. And let's now see what would have happened if Garp attacked Akainu at Marineford. Did you ever wonder what would happen if Sengoku didn't stop Garp from attacking Akainu? Who would win in the battle between these two? And what would happen to Garp afterward? Now, for this scenario to happen, we'll assume that Sengoku was busy fighting someone else, or he simply wasn't paying attention, which gave Garp the chance to sneak up to Akainu. So the first thing we need to establish is Garp even strong enough to do anything significant to Akainu? Well, considering he was the Pirate King's #1 rival, and that he was offered to become an admiral many times before, we know that Garp is monstrously strong. Even in his old age, he still managed to invade Hachinosu and overpower Kuzan, which is, well, pretty damn impressive. On top of all of that, it's also important to mention that Akainu wouldn't expect this betrayal from Garp, meaning the Vice Admiral would have an element of surprise. So yeah, it's pretty clear that Garp is more than strong enough to defeat Akainu, and when Sengoku isn't looking, he would jump straight toward him and hit him with the full-power Galaxy Punch, shaking the entire island in the process. From this point on, there are 3 different ways the story could continue. So let's go through each one and see what kind of world-changing consequences would this action bring. In the first scenario, after the initial attack hits Akainu, enraged Garp would just continue relentlessly punching him while he's on the ground. At this point, Garp wouldn't think clearly about any punishment or consequences that may arise from this, and his sole goal would be to kill the Admiral. It's also possible that Whitebeard would come to help him out, as he too is enraged and can't control himself. Now, it's important to mention that Garp and Whitebeard wouldn't really be teaming up here. They just happen to have a common enemy. Their combined punches would leave no time for Akainu to defend, counterattack, or escape, and eventually, Garp would finish him off and kill him. And although that's kinda a good thing, how would the rest of the war go considering this major change? Well, it's safe to assume that Blackbeard would still show up to end Whitebeard and take his fruit. The Marines would be conflicted, not knowing what to do about Garp, and Kobe would be devastated witnessing his mentor murdering someone, as in the original story. Shanks would come to end the war, though his arrival wouldn't be as epic now considering Akainu is not a threat anymore. Two big changes here are that Luffy wouldn't get his iconic scar, as Akainu isn't alive to punch him, and due to the Marineford War being broadcasted, the entire world would see what Garp did. This would put the world government in a really bad light and infuriate Gorosei. But by now you must be wondering, what will happen to Garp after this? Will he continue being a Marine? After calming down and realizing what he did, Garp would feel like a failure. Garp knows what's right and what's wrong very well, but sadly, he let the rage get the best of him. He wouldn't attempt to resist or fight other Marines to escape, he would just surrender and let them take him away. So, what's the punishment for this atrocious crime? Well, we don't really know. Nobody in the story so far has ever done something like this, but there's one clue in the manga that can help us guess what would happen to Garp here. You see, during one of Garp's conversations with Sengoku, the Fleet Admiral told him that the only reason he is still a Marine is because of his past achievements and because people around the world like him. So, after everyone around the world witnesses Garp killing an Admiral, the world government will have absolutely no reason to keep him around and would want to get rid of him. On top of that, Garp is a member of the D Clan, known to create huge problems for the government, which is another reason not to keep him alive. This is why instead of jail time, Garp would immediately be sentenced to public execution. He wouldn't protest in the slightest and would accept his punishment. In the end, he would die in a similar manner to Roger, just without the cool speech. Now, Garp may be dead here, but that's still not the end of this scenario, because with both him and Akainu gone, the world would change significantly. So, you know how Aokiji and Akainu fought to see who would become the new Fleet Admiral? Well, with Akainu gone, the world government higher-ups would desperately try to find another candidate other than Aokiji. Kizaru would be a good choice, but I don't think he would agree to fight over some kind of title, because that's just not like him. And besides Kizaru, whoever else they decide to pick has a 0% chance of defeating Aokiji, so he'd become the new Fleet Admiral. And trust me, this is not a small change, as Aokiji's and Akainu's views on justice are completely different. First of all, Aokiji is a lot more forgiving and understanding, which would overall make the entire Marines more fair. Also, due to his character, it's hard to believe that he would let someone like Green Bull become an admiral, and it's more likely that someone different will fill this spot. However, not everything is as good as it seems, as this development will also lead to two heartbreaking events. One of those is that Smoker and the rest of his team would get killed on Punk Hazard by Doflamingo because Kuzan never joined the Blackbeard Pirates and wouldn't be there to save them. The other is that Kobe would most likely die on Hachinosu as Garp isn't alive to rescue him. Okay, this scenario went pretty badly, but there are still two more scenarios left to cover, and I can't wait for you guys to see what will happen in the last one. But before that, let's cover the second scenario, which is even worse than the previous one. Here, we'll assume that after getting hit by Garp, Akainu doesn't immediately go down and manages to stay on his feet. Now, this isn't too hard to imagine, as even Aokiji managed to tank multiple punches from Garp when they battled on Hachinosu. Okay, but how does this change anything? Well, you see, if Akainu is still conscious after this attack, it's not like he just stand there and wait for Garp to beat him up, and would most likely try to escape. After tanking some punches, he would counterattack with his Great Eruption attack, and while Garp blocks it, he would use his 𝐿'𝐷𝐴 abilities to hide inside the ground, same as he did in the original story when Whitebeard was attacking him. From here on, Akainu would stay in hiding and wait for Sengoku and the others to calm Garp down. In the meantime, Blackbeard also arrives on the island and kills Whitebeard, and overall the war ends pretty similarly to the canon version, minus Luffy's scar. Now, although Garp didn't kill an admiral in this scenario, he still tried to do it, and will be sent to Impel Down shortly after the war. As we already discussed, the world government doesn't really like Garp, and would rather have him executed. However, since he didn't actually kill anyone this time around, I believe many people around the world would oppose this decision, as they still view Garp as a hero and a legend. Not wanting to risk people turning against them, the world government wouldn't go through with the execution, and would decide to leave him in prison. Knowing what he did was wrong, Garp wouldn't try to escape and would agree to stay locked up. Okay, that's pretty sad. But now that 𝐿 survived, who would win the duel and become the new fleet admiral? One important thing to remember here is how close the duel between Aokiji and 𝐿 actually was. I mean, the two of them fought for literally 10 days until 𝐿 won. Since both admirals are alive, this duel would still happen even in this scenario. But this time around, Aokiji would be a big favorite due to all the damage 𝐿 took during the war. Even if the government gives him time to recover, it's not like he'll ever be the same after taking the Galaxy Punch. Now, don't get me wrong, this duel would still be insanely close, but I'm certain Aokiji would manage to win this time and get promoted. From here on, everything would go the same as in the previous scenario with Smoker dying and Green Bull never becoming an admiral. Oh, also, I believe 𝐿 would still continue being an admiral as his only goal is to catch as many pirates as possible. So it's not like he has anywhere else to go. With this covered, we have only one more scenario left, and this last one is the most interesting by far, and the scenario that we all secretly wanted to happen. Same as in the first one, we'll assume that 𝐿 managed to catch 𝐿 off guard and kill him. However, this time, instead of letting the Marines capture him, he would hold his ground and try to escape. One reason he may do this is because after seeing Ace die, 𝐿 would want to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen to anyone else he cares about, like Luffy or Kobe. And if he wants to be there for them, he can't spend the rest of his life in prison. Now, you may be thinking that escaping Marineford is crazy because it's filled with Marines, but there's one thing you're forgetting. You see, Monkey D. 𝐿 is a legend within the Marines, and many soldiers look up to him. This is why I believe a lot of them wouldn't even try to stop 𝐿 and would stay away. And let's be honest, even if some Marines tried to stop him, it's not like they could ever hope to do any real damage to him. The only ones capable of actually stopping 𝐿 here are either admirals, warlords, or Sengoku. We already know that warlords didn't really care about this war that much, so it's unlikely any of them would go out of their way to chase 𝐿. Aokiji also wouldn't want to fight his old teacher and would probably just look the other way. Sengoku seems the most qualified to fight 𝐿 here because at the end of the day, it's his responsibility to keep the Marines in order. Also, it would be thematically fitting considering Sengoku is also a veteran Marine of the previous era, same as 𝐿. Now, based on what we've seen so far in the series, 𝐿 should be stronger than Sengoku, right? Yeah, but there's a problem. You see, although 𝐿 betrayed the Marines by killing 𝐿, he's not the bad guy, and he wouldn't just go all out and attack Sengoku. It's more likely that he would just attempt to dodge his attacks as much as possible and focus on escaping. So, would he be able to do it? Well, if it's only Sengoku chasing 𝐿, I'm sure he would have no problem escaping. But there's actually another guy on the battlefield who would also join the chase, Admiral 𝐾𝐫𝐲. Contrary to Aokiji, 𝐾𝐫𝐲 doesn't really care what happens to 𝐿, and if he's ordered to stop him, I just don't see him refusing the order. With these two now after him, 𝐿 would eventually be overwhelmed and captured. So wait, if 𝐿 was captured anyway, doesn't that mean this scenario is pretty much the same as the first one? Well, no, because there's one big difference now. This time around, 𝐿 wants to live and be there for his family, so he wouldn't just let the Marines execute him and would try to escape instead. But how is he going to pull that off? Well, due to the immense respect 𝐿 holds within the Marines, it's quite possible that some of his former students like Aokiji would help him escape in some way. Maybe by loosening his cuffs a bit or leaving the cell open. But even if that doesn't happen, it's important to remember that 𝐿 is one of the strongest hockey users in the story, which means it's pretty much impossible to keep him imprisoned. Also, he's not a devil fruit user, meaning sea stone cuffs aren't going to stop him either. I mean, just imagine someone like 𝐿 being put on an execution stand tied with chains. He's breaking those in no time. So 𝐿 managed to escape. That's great! But what would happen to him now that he's on the run? Being a high-ranking Marine for the majority of his life, 𝐿 surely knows many of the government's secrets. One of those is the God Valley incident, a secret that the government tried so hard to bury for years. This is why 𝐿 would quickly become one of the most wanted men on the seas. Maybe not the most wanted one because that spot is reserved for Dragon, but I believe he would be a close second. But how high would his bounty be? First of all, I think it's obvious that 𝐿's bounty would be higher than those of the Emperor's, simply because he is way too powerful and knows way too much. After looking at current Emperor's bounties, I think it's safe to say that 𝐿's bounty could easily go as high as 5 billion berries. I mean, the guy is the first person in the story to kill an admiral. I think this bounty is justified. So now that Garp has a bounty and is on the run, does that mean he's going to become a pirate? Not so fast. Although Garp's life is now turned upside down, the fact is the guy still hates piracy and doesn't really care about treasures. It's more likely that he would just roam around the sea by himself and stay out of trouble. If any Marines were to find him, he'd be careful not to hurt them and would just run away. With time, Garp would realize how it feels to be on this side of the law and that celestial dragons are even worse than he thought. He would slowly understand why Dragon became a revolutionary and would seek to meet with him and join their efforts in freeing the world. Man, I'm kinda sad this scenario didn't actually happen in the show. It would be so cool. However, one scenario I'm glad never happened was Kaido coming to Marineford. But what if he did? Okay, so you all know how Kaido wanted to come to Marineford and join the war. Thankfully, he was intercepted and stopped by Shanks. But what if that never happened? What if Shanks was too late to stop him? Firstly, let's see which side Kaido would fight on. Would he help the Marines and attack Whitebeard, or would it be the other way around? Honestly, I doubt Kaido would join any sides at all. His only goal here is to kill Whitebeard, and if anyone else tries to oppose him, he will crush them no matter who they are. So how would the battle play out now that there are two Emperor crews on the field? The first big change is that Blackbeard will most likely not show up. He is very cautious about who he fights, and with Kaido there, he'd be terrified and wouldn't attempt to pull anything off. Of course, the Marines would immediately recognize that Kaido is currently a much bigger threat than Whitebeard due to his destructive nature. Still, for now, they'll wait and observe. Immediately after joining the war, Kaido attacks Whitebeard, and the two will clash in one of the most epic battles the series have ever seen. Marco and other commanders would instantly jump in to help their captain, but they are stopped by the king, queen, and Jack, who tell them not to disturb. Kaido and Whitebeard would be evenly matched, and their battle would create complete chaos, destroying half of the base in the process. We can assume that at this point, Luffy would rush in to rescue Ace and unintentionally activate his Conqueror's Haki, shocking everyone on the battlefield. This, along with the destruction Kaido and Whitebeard are causing, should be enough for Luffy to come in and save his brother. However, Akainu immediately engages them, and since no one is around to help, Ace dies protecting his brother. But as soon as the Admiral tries to kill Luffy, a strong burst of Haki stops him in his tracks. Of course, it's Shanks. Although he was late to stop Kaido, he followed him to the base. He also brought this ridiculously big subscribe button that you should definitely click. Anyway, he would try to help Whitebeard, but the latter would refuse, saying something like, "This is my battle, red hair. Don't interrupt me or I'll kill you too." Shanks would listen and would not try to help him. Sengoku would probably order admirals not to attack red hair pirates and to wait for their chance instead. After a long and fierce battle, Whitebeard is completely out of strength due to his illness, and Kaido finishes him off with one last attack. Having done what he came here to do, Kaido would attempt to leave the base, but seeing their chance, Marines would try to intercept and defeat him while he is still exhausted from his battle. Shanks would use this chaos to safely leave with Luffy. Kaido and his commanders would battle all the Marines, including Garp and Sengoku. What would actually happen here is really hard to guess, but considering that the Marines are at their full strength and that Kaido is injured, I think they would actually manage to bring him down. 12 more scenarios are left to cover, and I'll let my friend Sky take over for this next one.
Did you ever wonder what would happen if Luffy awakened his Gear 5 abilities at the start of the show? Would he be able to defeat the people he lost to? And what would his crew look like? Would there be any new members? And most importantly, would he finally be able to save his brother? Well, for this to work, we'll say that Luffy awakened his Nika form while still a kid training with Ace and Garp. From here on, he'd start training with his new abilities and would eventually set sail once he turned 17. Now, to make this video more interesting, we can go ahead and skip the next 3 story arcs. Shellstown, Orangetown, and Syrup Village, as Luffy's opponents in these arcs were already pretty weak, and him being in Nika would change absolutely nothing. However, it's on Beta Tea where our crew's journey gets interesting, as this is where they meet with Mihawk, who shows them just how weak they are compared to the big-time pirates. Now that Luffy already has Gear 5 unlocked, would he be able to actually defeat Mihawk this early on? First of all, Luffy's big fight on Beta Tea was against Don Krieg, and even though Luffy managed to beat him just as a regular rubberman, he did get badly injured and lose a lot of blood. However, now that Luffy has his Nika abilities, he'd be able to finish his fight with Don Krieg before Mihawk even arrives, because it would literally take one punch. But we all knew that, so let's now cover something much more interesting. Luffy versus Mihawk. How would that go? Well, upon Zoro's loss, Luffy would become enraged and transform into Nika to attack Mihawk. At this point, Mihawk would try to explain that he doesn't intend to hurt Luffy or his crew, but Luffy being Luffy would not listen to a word he has to say and would proceed to attack him. Considering Luffy doesn't have Haki developed at this point, Mihawk would easily block his attack, but would be shocked at how strong he is. In order to stop him, Mihawk would have to slice Luffy too, gravely wounding him and giving him a scar similar to Zoro's. Now you may be thinking that Luffy having Gear 5 unlocked changed nothing in this arc as they lost to Mihawk anyway, but that's wrong. You see, in the original story, by the time Luffy was done with Don Krieg, Nami was already back on Arlong Park, but if she witnessed the power of Gear 5 Luffy, do you really think she'd still betray him? I don't think so. It's more likely that she'd just straight up ask him to free her village from Arlong, as she's confident that he can do it. I doubt Luffy would have a problem with making a quick detour to free the citizens of Kokoyasi village. He would swoop in there alone, easily defeating Arlong and all the other fishmen with his giant fists. But this now creates a problem. While it's nice of Luffy to finish the job himself, the other crewmates, namely Usopp, Zoro, and Sanji, wouldn't be able to get stronger since they'd never have a strong opponent to fight against. Another interesting thing is that since the Straw Hats would be done fighting so soon, they wouldn't cross paths with Marine Captain Izumi, which means Luffy wouldn't get his first bounty yet. Although Loketown is really a short arc, now that Luffy has Gear 5, there'd be a couple of major differences. Firstly, Luffy being reckless would still get captured by Buggy, but considering he now has Gear 5 abilities, he could just make himself thinner and escape. No need for that lucky Thunder Strike from Dragon to free him. Another major difference is that since Luffy doesn't have a bounty yet, Smoker wouldn't attempt to catch him as he'd have no reason to. This also means Dragon wouldn't have to get involved and would just watch Luffy from a distance. And now the crew finally enters the Grand Line. I'll skip Whiskey Peak and Little Garden as those islands were never really a problem for the Straw Hats and the opponents there are not really worth mentioning. The only cool thing that would happen is that Gear 5 Luffy would briefly fight against Zoro on Whiskey Peak, which would be really cool to see. Click the subscribe button right now and I'll show you exactly what that would look like. 3, 2, 1. Okay, you asked for it. On their way to Alabasta, the crew picks up Chopper and beats up Wapol. Not many changes there either. However, Luffy now has to face his toughest opponent so far, the Warlord of the Sea, Crocodile. And let me tell you, this battle doesn't really go as planned. As in the original, the crew would meet up with Ace and eventually get trapped in the Sea Stone Cage. After escaping, however, the Gear 5 Luffy and Crocodile will finally clash. And, well, despite his Gear 5, Luffy would get absolutely destroyed. You see, no matter how strong Luffy's awakened form is, he still hasn't learned Haki at this point, which means all of his attacks against Crocodile are pointless. So even in this scenario, Luffy still loses and gets saved by Robin. However, when he returns for a rematch, now knowing Crocodile's weakness to water, the battle immediately becomes unfair. I mean, just imagine seeing a giant Gear 5 Luffy covered with water. Crocodile would be terrified. He'd desperately be trying to defend against Luffy's powerful wet attacks, but would eventually get overwhelmed and defeated. Now, since Luffy defeated Crocodile early in this scenario, it means that he didn't save Robin in the ruins later on, which now creates a problem. Would Robin now even join the Straw Hats? Although we can't know for sure, I'm guessing she'd still join solely because she has nowhere else to go, but she wouldn't really consider them friends yet. Now, many people don't like the Skypiea arc because it feels like a filler and is also pretty long. And while this Gear 5 Luffy can't change how you feel about this arc, he can certainly shorten it by a lot. The whole reason why this arc was so long is because everyone was split up and Luffy got eaten by a snake. Yeah, not one of his brightest moments. Anyway, the reason he was eaten was that the snake surprise attacked him while he was fighting Wiper, but that fight would have been long over if Luffy had Gear 5 at his disposal, which means he'd be ready to defend against the snake. This means he'd be there to face Enel with the rest of his crew more than 20 chapters earlier. After figuring out that Enel can't hit him, it would only take Luffy a few punches to launch Enel far off the island, freeing everyone from his oppression. Now, one problem with this is that Enel may just look for a new island on the sea to rule, but I guess we can let the Navy worry about that. And while Skypiea went much better than expected for the Straw Hats, their confidence will quickly be completely destroyed. You see, after returning to the Blue Sea, the crew goes to Long Ring Long Land and eventually encounters the Marine Admiral Aokiji. Sensing that Aokiji is incredibly strong, Luffy sends everyone back to prepare the ship while he stalls Now, since Aokiji is another Logia user, Luffy obviously can't punch him, but that doesn't mean he'll be immediately defeated. Since Gear 5 allows Luffy to do pretty much anything as long as he can imagine it, I can easily see him turning Aokiji's ice into rubber and dodging his attacks that way. Still, considering he can't really hit Aokiji, he would eventually get exhausted and completely frozen. Just like in the original story, Aokiji would spare his life since Luffy saved Alabasta from Crocodile, but would put out a word to the Marines that this rookie pirate is way more dangerous than he looks. This is why Luffy's bounty at this point will be much higher than in the original, probably around 500 million berries. And although this arc played out similarly to the original, the crew now arrives at Water 7, and here's where absolutely everything changes, and some of it's absolutely heartbreaking. As in the original, as soon soon as they arrive, Robin would let the CP9 agents take her away since she thinks the Straw Hats stand no chance against them. Now, fast forward to when the crew infiltrates Iceberg's mansion and meets face to face with Lucci and the other agents. In the canon version, this fight didn't really go well for the Straw Hats, and they were absolutely humiliated. However, considering none of the CP9 agents have Logia abilities, and considering that Luffy has awakened one of the strongest devil fruits in the series, he would wipe the floor with them. I mean, it only took Gear 3 to defeat Lucci in the original, so just imagine how would the fight look if he had Gear 5 at this point. Since all the agents are now defeated, Luffy and the others rescue Robin from the train before it even departs for Enies Lobby, which means that the entire story arc would get skipped. But not everything is as great as it seems. You see, since the crew never went to Enies Lobby, that also means they never bonded with Frankie, so he'd have no real reason to join the crew and make them a ship. Considering they saved Iceberg earlier, he'd probably give them a really good ship with other shipwrights made, but it just wouldn't be Thousand Sunny. Wow, I can't believe that Luffy being this strong would actually lead to Frankie not joining the crew. But regardless, the adventure must keep going, and the next destination is Thriller Bark, where Luffy's powers will actually make everything much harder. In the canon version, after meeting Brook and arriving on the island, Sanji and Zoro are immediately caught off guard and kidnapped to have their shadows extracted. Now, Luffy's situation is a bit different because he was perfectly on guard, fighting in a room full of relatively weak zombies, yet he still got captured somehow off screen. I'll just assume that they gave him some meat and kindly asked him to step into a trap, which is a strategy that would also work against Gear 5 Luffy. But now that Luffy's shadow is extracted, there's a huge problem. You see, the body that gets Luffy's shadow will also get all of his abilities, meaning that Oars would most likely be able to use some of Nika's abilities. Seeing as the Straw Hats really struggle to deal with just regular Oars, they'd be absolutely overwhelmed this time while waiting for Luffy to come back and help them. But although Luffy's new abilities created a big problem here, they'd also lead to something so cool. So after chasing Moria's clone, Luffy ends up in the forest where he meets the Rolling Pirates, who all lost their shadows to Moria and decided to feed Luffy all the shadows they'd been collecting over the years. And let me tell you, Gear 5 Shadow Luffy would be one of the most insane transformations ever. I'd say it's even close to the Emperor level, so you bet Moria and Oars couldn't do much against this monster. And just when everyone thinks the battle is over, another warlord, Kuma, steps in with his order to eliminate Luffy. At this point, the Straw Hats would all be badly injured from fighting Nika Oars, but Luffy would be mostly fine so he could fight Kuma one-on-one. Since Kuma is a revolutionary, even if he could defeat Luffy, it's not like he actually planned to kill or capture him in the first place, so he'd just leave Thriller Bark after testing Luffy's strength. What this unfortunately means, we'll never get Zoro's badass nothing happened moment. Alright, but now we come to the crew's biggest challenge so far, the 𝐶𝐲𝐵𝐷𝐸 Archipelago, where all their dreams were crushed last time. So will the power of the Sun God be enough for them to survive Kizaru's and Kuma's attacks and to get to Fishman Island? Well, one small thing to note is that, as we already discussed, Luffy's bounty would be around 500 million berries, which would make him the supernova with the highest bounty. Sorry, kid. Anyway, it's safe to assume that he'd still punch a world noble and get an admiral sent after him. Now, as we already mentioned several times in the video, Luffy once again can't do anything about Kizaru since he's a Logia, but he will not have this problem for much longer. Anyway, Rayleigh would come to the Straw Hats' aid and keep the admiral busy while they try to manage against Kuma. Since Luffy is now much stronger than in the original, he would charge full speed at Kuma in order to defeat him, but considering Kuma's insane speed, he would just avoid Luffy and focus on deleting his crewmates one by one. By the time Kuma was done teleporting everyone, Luffy would lose all fighting spirit and surrender, getting teleported as well. Although at this moment Luffy will realize how helpless he and his crew truly are against some of the strongest characters in the show, it's only going to get harder from this point on, and if he wants to save his brother this time around, Luffy will have to do everything right. But can he manage to pull it off? But before that, he arrives on Amazon Lily, where he makes friends with Boa, who decides to help him break into Impel Down. And do you know what the best part is? There are no Logias in Impel Down, meaning that Luffy will be able to show off his true strength. His journey through levels 1, 2, and 3 would be a piece of cake, since numerous beasts and even the mighty Sphinx would be no match for him. Level 4 is where he met and lost to Magellan, but that wouldn't be the case this time. An important thing to remember here is that although Magellan looks like a Logia, he is in fact not, and he can only cover himself with poison, not turn into it. Considering Luffy's ridiculous abilities, I bet he could come up with a way to turn Magellan's poison into rubber and dodge his attacks that way. And if he manages to do that, there's nothing stopping him from beating the Warden to a pulp and continuing to the lower levels. Sadly for Luffy, after hearing of his break-in, the Marines would send someone to move Ace to Marineford ahead of schedule, meaning that by the time Luffy reaches Ace's cell, Ace would already be gone. Still, he would meet Jinbei and assemble his little prison escape group, which he would take to Marineford Marineford to save his brother. One change here is that since Luffy didn't lose to Magellan, he never went to New Kama Land and met Ivankov, meaning he and his men wouldn't be present with the rest of the prison escape group. And although that part is pretty unfortunate, it's not that big of a problem for Luffy, since as long as he has his imagination, everything is possible, even saving Ace. Maybe. Let's see. Upon arriving, Luffy would still have to run through countless marines, but with the help from Boa and the Whitebeard pirates, he'd eventually make it under the execution stand. Since Ivankov is not present, there's no one to revive Luffy if he gets beaten, so he really only has one chance to get up there. Also, without Inazuma to make the path for him, Luffy would have to improvise. Luckily, he has the most ridiculous power in the entire story, so there's many ways he could get up there. For example, he could turn the floor into rubber and use it as a trampoline, or just simply run up there on air like a Looney Tunes character. Like in the original, he would punch Garp out of the way and free Ace. Now, the only reason Ace died in the main story is because Luffy was injured and could barely move, so he sacrificed his life in order to protect him. However, this time around, Luffy wouldn't suffer any major injuries, so there'd be no need for Ace to die. Also, as I said already, Luffy's Gear 5 allows him to do pretty much anything, so escaping from Marineford should be much easier as well. He can pretty much just launch Ace and himself to safety using his rubber powers or transform into a giant and escape that way. Of course, I believe Whitebeard would still die fighting, but since Ace now survived, his last words may also be different. This time, he may choose to yell out to Ace to escape and live his life to the fullest instead of yelling about One Piece. After the war, Ace and Luffy make their way back to 𝐷𝐸, and there, they're stopped by Rayleigh, who suggests they train with him because Luffy and his crew are nowhere strong enough to enter the New World. Seeing as the Whitebeard pirates got destroyed, Ace would have to find a new crew, and I believe he'd very much like to be part of his younger brother's crew, which would make Ace the new Straw Hat. The two of them would train on Rusakaina with Rayleigh for the next 2 years and meet up with everyone else to continue their journey. Okay, so you're probably wondering, now that Luffy can finally use Haki, how easy is everything gonna get? Will the crew be able to defeat some of the emperors earlier in the show? Would anyone even be able to stop this monstrous crew? Well, firstly, the Fishman Island arc was never really the problem for the Straw Hats, so now that Luffy has Gear 5 plus Haki, everything will be much easier, and the crew will absolutely destroy both Hody Jones and Vanderdecken. After that, Punk Hazard will also go pretty smoothly since Caesar Clown was never a serious opponent to begin with. But let's now cover the three most important arcs: Dressrosa, Whole Cake, and Wano, where Luffy's new abilities will completely disrupt the story and may even lead to the death of some crewmates. On Dressrosa, two things would be completely different. First, since Ace is now alive, there'd be no competition for the Meta Meta no Mi, meaning Luffy wouldn't meet Bartolomeo, Cavendish, and the others, which would ultimately lead to the Grand Fleet never being created. Also, Ace being alive means that Sabo wouldn't regain his memories and wouldn't reunite with his brothers on this island. So it's most likely Ace who would do Sabo's job and keep Admiral Fujitora busy while everything is going down. But he wouldn't have to do that for long because Luffy would be finished with Doflamingo before the Warlord could even activate his birdcage. After this, there wouldn't be any need to rest on Dressrosa for 3 days as the crew is not that badly injured, so they'd just continue their journey the next day. Zoe would also remain relatively the same, as I don't see Luffy's strength changing anything significant here, so the crew would head to Whole Cake Island in order to rescue Sanji. And this is where Luffy's power will be put to a real test, as he'll have to battle against the Emperor of the Sea for the first time. Will he actually manage to pull off something like this? The big fight of this arc is Luffy versus Cracker, and instead of eating Cracker's biscuits like in the original story, Luffy could just turn them all into rubber and look for an opening to slam Cracker and defeat him in one swift blow. Although he now wouldn't be injured at all after this battle, it wouldn't really matter as he'd still take a beating from Sanji and decide to stay there until he gets back. This means that he'd be both injured and hungry by the time Big Mom's army gets there, so unfortunately, even in this scenario, he would probably lose to them. The alliance with the Fire Tank Pirates and the assassination attempt on Big Mom would go about the same, with Luffy ending up in the Mirror World facing off against Katakuri. With his advanced observation Haki, Katakuri can dodge any attack, that is, if he can react in time. And this would prove to be quite difficult since Gear 5 is insanely fast. After turning Big Mom's stronger officer into a pretzel, Luffy exits the Mirror World and goes straight for the hungry, weakened Big Mom while the rest of his crew defends against her children. Now, Luffy still can't use Advanced Conqueror's Haki at this point, but still, Big Mom was just so weak due to her condition that I think Luffy would definitely keep up and eventually defeat her, shocking everyone. And now there's only one destination left for the Straw Hats, Wano, where they'll need to fight against the world's strongest creature, Kaido. You may be thinking that Wano will be a piece of cake now since they have to worry only about one emperor, but what if I tell you that Big Mom's absence would actually lead to tragedy among the Straw Hats? After thinking Kaido just killed all of his friends, enraged Luffy would fly straight at him with everything he's got. Now, while this attack would definitely hurt Kaido this time, most of the damage would be blocked by his scales. The longer the fight goes on, the better it becomes for Kaido because Luffy would start getting pretty tired from all those relentless attacks. In the end, he'd lose the fight and be sent to prison with Kid. But as it turns out, getting sent to prison is a good thing because here he meets Hyogoro, who teaches him the key to defeating Kaido, the advanced armament haki. On the day of the raid, Luffy would spend no time getting to the rooftop to assist the scabbards, and they just leave the fight to Luffy after seeing how outmatched they are. Luffy would fight evenly against Kaido now that he can pierce his scales with advanced armament haki, and what's even better is that 𝐵 will soon arrive at the rooftop to help him since, well, 𝐵𝐵 is defeated, so it's not like they have anything better to do. However, while all this is going on, Usopp, Nami, and Tama are struggling against Page 1 and Ulti, and as you may remember, the one who saves them is none other than 𝐵𝐵. But since she's already defeated now, she isn't here, which means that these three will unfortunately be killed by the Beast Pirates. Luffy, sensing that something bad has happened, would be so mad that he'd go all out, and with the help from his comrades from the Worst Generation, he'd eventually overwhelm Kaido and defeat him. Wano would finally be freed from the Beast Pirates' rule, but the Straw Hats would leave the island without any partying, mourning the losses of their crewmates. Wow, who would have guessed that Luffy awakening this insanely strong power early on would actually lead to such a bad outcome in the end? Okay, that was definitely unexpected, but did you ever wonder what would happen if these characters had devil fruits? Which one would be the best fit for them, and how strong would they be afterward? Well, after going through more than 100 different devil fruits, I found the perfect ones, and where better to start than with legendary pirate king, Gold Teeth Roger. Roger was known to be an unstoppable force with his ridiculously powerful haki, and from what we can tell, he has seemingly never lost a battle before. So if Roger was already this strong, did you ever wonder what would happen if he ever ate a devil fruit? If we want to theorize what could happen in this scenario, we first need to figure out which devil fruit would be best suited for him. Instead of mentioning just one, let's take a look at two, starting with none other than the one his son ate, the 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 no Mi. Besides the regular Logia abilities this fruit grants the user, I think Roger would find other unique ways to use it. For example, the 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 no Mi could work so well in combination with his legendary sword Ace, possibly allowing him to carry out fiery long-range attacks on opponents before they even come close to him. It would also allow him to travel faster, and he could even engage his opponents at lightning speeds using the flames as a type of engine launch pad for his feet. Okay, I know this looks ridiculous, but it's Roger we're talking about here. It's not really hard to imagine that he'd try something like this. The other devil fruit I wanted to talk about is 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 no Mi, or as it's secretly known, 𝐿𝐻𝐻𝐻 no Mi, Moro Nika. This mythical Zoan devil fruit is the biggest threat to the world government and a legendary fruit linked to Joy Boy. So why would this fruit be the best choice for Roger? Well, throughout the series it was shown multiple times that Roger and Luffy share a lot of similar traits, from their laid-back personality to straight up saying the same things and even their mutual love for hitting the subscribe button. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you should definitely click it. Thanks. Anyway, it's only natural that they also have the same devil fruit. Roger would certainly unlock the awakening of the fruit during his adventures, the same as Luffy did, which means that he'd have not only the rubber abilities, but also the reality warping potential of its awakened form. By the way, I just made a sun god drawing of Roger for this video, and you have to admit, he looks so cool. So, after reviewing both fruits, which would be the better choice for Roger? In my opinion, it's definitely the 𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵𝐵 no Mi, due to its ties to Luffy and Joy Boy. But Flaming Roger would be sick too. Roronoa Zoro. Zoro, the vice captain of the Straw Hat Pirates, is a master swordsman who will stop at nothing to achieve his dream of becoming the strongest swordsman in the world. His unique fighting style consists of wielding 3 katanas simultaneously and it is known as the 3-sword style. So the ideal fruit for Zoro would probably work around this fighting style in some way and enhance it. At first glance, the obvious choice would be Mr. One's fruit, 𝐶𝐵𝐶𝐵 no Mi, which allows users to convert body parts into blades. This could work really well for Zoro in some cases. For example, when he's completely missing his swords or needs one more to complete his stance. However, the downside to this fruit is that these swords would be much weaker than his usual swords like Enma or Shusui, and therefore would greatly limit his abilities. Other than this one, we could consider some Logia type fruits for Zoro, since those would help increase his overall abilities, but let's make it a bit more interesting and give him a fruit that most of you have never even heard of. This fruit is currently unnamed, but it's wielded by the Marine Vice Admiral Onigumo. This devil fruit seemingly is some kind of spider zoan and allows its user to have 6 extra arms appear from their back. This fruit would be perfect for Zoro, as he'd be able to hold 9 blades at the same time. Just imagine all the extra techniques he could come up with. Now, some of you may say that Zoro can already use 9-sword style while utilizing Ashura, but the difference here is that he wouldn't drain so much energy each time he activates it. Another advantage would be that Zoro could find even more legendary swords throughout the One Piece world and use them all at the same time. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think we'll ever find a more fitting fruit for Zoro. There's still 6 interesting characters left to cover, and the next one is Zoro's biggest obstacle, Dracul Mihawk. Mihawk is the world's strongest swordsman and is actually the first warlord that we were introduced to in the series. His main weapon is a gigantic sword named Yoru, and based on the little fighting we've seen from him, he seems to be easily an Emperor-level fighter. Mihawk is clearly inspired by the legendary vampire Dracula, with his own name being Dracul, and his overall design being very horror-inspired. This is exactly why I think 𝐵𝐫𝐸, Moriya's devil fruit, would suit him pretty well. There's another perfect fruit for Mihawk in the series, but let's go one at a time. With 𝐵𝐫𝐸, Mihawk could collect the shadows of all people he takes down. Now, since Mihawk is already insanely powerful, he wouldn't really need an army of shadows to defend him. He would instead collect them as trophies and to punish people who are stupid enough to challenge him. This would also play well into the idea of vampirism, with Mihawk's opponents evaporated by sunlight when they lost a duel. Okay, this fruit is literally made for Mihawk, but what if I tell you that another fruit may suit him even better? 𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵𝐵, model vampire. You probably think I'm making this fruit up, but it actually exists in the One Piece universe, specifically in the video game, Unlimited World Red. The fruit literally transforms the user into a vampire and gives them the ability to teleport and suck the life force from others. Since the 𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵 is not canon, I won't spend any more time talking about it. But it's surely my final pick for Mihawk, as it's undeniably the one that suits him the best. Kozuki Oden. Oden, the legendary son of Wano, managed to become one of the most powerful men alive due to his exceptional swordsmanship and haki control. The first devil fruit I picked for him may seem a bit weird to some of you, but it's actually the 𝐵𝗲𝗏𝗏, NL's devil fruit, that allows its user to manipulate and even transform into lightning themselves. So the reason I'd give this fruit to Oden is because I believe he's already strong enough offensively, and with the fruit's Logia properties, he would become invincible. He would also be able to move at lightning speeds and slash his opponents without them even noticing unless they have advanced observation haki developed. The only way Oden could lose a battle with this fruit is if the enemy he's fighting is for some reason immune to lightning, like Luffy was in his battle against NL. That said, the more fitting devil fruit for Oden thematically would be the 𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼, model 𝐿kuchi no Makami. This mythical Zoan fruit would allow him to transform into the Guardian of Wano, an ancient wolf deity. This is thematically fitting, considering Oden's royal bloodline and love for his nation, but also goes well with his fighting style, as Zoan fruit would grant him enhanced strength and speed without limiting him in any way. The ability to use ice attacks would be a cherry on top, but honestly, I don't see Oden using it that much, as he'd probably like to retain his samurai fighting style. So which of these two fruits would be better suited for Oden? Well, since we're trying to make characters as strong as possible by giving them devil fruits, I think NL's fruit is a better choice, as it's considered one of the invincible fruits in the world. With half of the characters covered, we're finally ready to talk about the one and only red-haired Shanks. Shanks is arguably the strongest emperor currently in the series. Although we have really limited information about him, we know that he has mastery of all forms of haki, especially Conqueror's, the most powerful one. What's interesting about the red-haired pirates is that they're the only known crew in the series in which not a single member has devil fruit abilities. So what if their already insanely overpowered captain had one? Which one would it be? Okay, let's start by pairing him with one of the devil fruits his fellow emperor has, Blackbeard's 𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵𝐻𝐵 no Mi. This Logia type devil fruit would grant him the power of darkness, essentially allowing him to nullify other devil fruit powers and absorb things around him like a black hole. If you're wondering why I'm giving Shanks this specific devil fruit, there's a simple reason for that. Shanks is primarily a haki-based fighter, relying on his powerful Conqueror's haki burst to completely paralyze his opponents. Imagine a man like that, also having the power to nullify other people's fruits. He'd be unstoppable. It's also possible that Shanks could use this fruit to send smaller black holes to suck in his opponent's weapons and equipment. Even the likes of the Admirals would stand no chance against him, as their strong Logia devil fruits would be pretty much useless, and they'd have to fight him using only haki. And let's just say that wouldn't go very well for them. Another devil fruit that would suit Shanks perfectly is 𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵𝐵 no Mi, also belonging to one of his adversaries, the Marine Fleet Admiral Akainu. This devil fruit was stated by Oda, the creator of One Piece, to be the one with the highest defensive capabilities in the world. It allows the user to turn into and control the boiling hot magma, which would also look pretty cool with Shanks' red hair and overall appearance. Of course, just looking good will unfortunately not cut it for this video, so let's see what it would bring to the table in terms of combat. During the Marineford arc, we were shown that Akainu can use this devil fruit to shoot the magma out of his hands. It's similar to the volcano erupting. Based on this, it's only natural that Shanks could do it too, most likely firing a big burst off of magma when he swings his sword. Like with other Logia devil fruits, it would make him much faster and harder to hit, and he could just turn into magma and disappear in seconds. Another advantage of this fruit is its simplicity. Shanks doesn't need to fly or turn into some kind of monster to be strong. He just needs a strong offensive devil fruit that won't get in his way while in combat. And that's why I'm picking 𝐵𝐴𝐷𝐵𝐵 no Mi as the best suited devil fruit for Shanks. Monkey D. Garp. 𝐷ARP is an absolute powerhouse and one of the strongest Marines to ever live. He has incredible physical strength and mastery of Haki, which we recently saw in the manga when he completely destroyed a part of the island with a single punch. The important thing to mention is that 𝐷ARP is not relying on any weapons to help him in battle. He only uses his bare fists. Therefore, we need to find a fruit that suits that fighting style best. Again, two devil fruits come to mind, and the first one is none other than 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝐴. The powerful quakes produced by this fruit, along with 𝐷ARP's punches, would surely bring his strength to the next level. You may not agree with me on this, but I think this fruit is way more suited for 𝐷ARP than it ever was for Whitebeard. Just think about it, this fruit can only be activated with the user's hands, meaning that when Whitebeard is in the middle of the battle and is holding his weapon, he can't really use it to its full potential. Now imagine 𝐷ARP, throwing punch after punch and each time producing the incredibly powerful shockwaves that shake the entire island that they're on. The destruction would be unfathomable. Another interesting option for 𝐷ARP would be the unknown Dalmatian Zoan fruit, which is owned by Vice Admiral Dalmatian. There's two reasons for this. First is that since 𝐷ARP relies on his physical strength in battles, any Zoan fruit would be a perfect choice as it would dramatically increase his strength and wouldn't slow him down in any way. The second reason is that since the show's beginning, 𝐷ARP was always accompanied by the symbol of a dog, usually on his mask, ship, or shirt. Although it would be really cool to see 𝐷ARP use a dog-themed fruit, at the end of the day, 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝐴 is obviously the best choice when it comes to strength. Before we explain which devil fruit would be the most suited for Dark King Rayleigh, let's first quickly cover Ben Beckman. Ben is one of the most respected men on the seas, and the second in command of the red-haired pirates. As with other crew members, he has no devil fruit, but it was confirmed that he's very skilled in using Haki. So much so that he can even infuse bullets with it. Now, since we know very little about Ben and his specific abilities, it was really hard to find the right fruit for him. But after some research, I think I finally found it, and I'm sure you weren't expecting this one. So, in my opinion, the best fruit for Ben Beckman is Foxy's fruit, 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗄𝐴. Okay, I know you're a bit confused, but hear me out. This devil fruit essentially allows its users to slow down every object they touch for 30 seconds. With that in mind, Ben could use this ability to slow down any attack that comes his way and maybe even opponents themselves. If we combine this ability with his Haki-infused bullets, Ben should, in theory, be able to shoot any opponent effortlessly, and since they're slowed, they wouldn't have a way to dodge it. It's also important to mention that due to Ben's experience, he would surely use the fruit much better than Foxy did, and could even develop some unique abilities like slowing down multiple enemies at the same time, or creating some sort of barrier around him so everyone who comes close gets slowed down. Silver's Rayleigh. Rayleigh, or as he's more commonly known, the Dark King, was the vice captain of the legendary Pirate King's crew and one of the strongest characters in the entire series. Like many other big shots on this list, he doesn't need a devil fruit. But there's actually one I'd really like to see him use, Blackbeard's fruit, the 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗄𝐴. I mean, first of all, he's literally the Dark King, so just imagine how cool it would be if he also possessed a Darkness Devil Fruit to go with that. Secondly, as we already mentioned in Shank's segment, this Logia Devil Fruit is probably the strongest one as it nullifies other fruits and can serve as a vortex to drag things into it. Although Rayleigh is a master of Haki, he still struggled against Admiral Kizaru during the 𝐵𝗫𝐵𝐷 arc, and if the battle was prolonged, he would probably have lost. Therefore, having this Devil Fruit to even the playing field and disable other people's abilities would be incredibly beneficial to him, as he could go toe-to-toe with any enemy. To be honest, I feel like pretty much any Logia type fruit would make Rayleigh insanely strong, but I just couldn't miss out on the opportunity to give him the dark one. Click on this video where we explained what would happen if all Straw Hats attacked Gear 5 Luffy together. But did you ever wonder what would have happened if the strongest Marines became pirates? How would their pirate crews look and how strong would they be? Is there anyone among them who could become the next king of the pirates? For example, Kizaru, the scariest of the 3 current admirals, would be just as, if not even scarier as a pirate. Imagine if he didn't have to listen to the celestial dragons and the higher-ups and could do whatever he wanted. First of all, I think it's safe to assume that he would still eat the 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝐴 at some point, as that had nothing to do with him being a marine. Of course, before venturing out to the sea, Kizaru would need to assemble a crew, because without them, there would be no one to remind him how Denden Mushi worked, and on top of that, I honestly doubt he could navigate the seas by himself. Now, just to be clear, in this video we'll not be exploring what would happen if these Marines became pirates today, but rather what would happen if they chose to become pirates in the first place when they were still young. Anyway, while sailing, Kizaru would usually act relaxed, and like he doesn't care much about anything around him. However, that would quickly change if someone anchors him enough. This happened once in the show after he failed to eliminate the Straw Hat Pirates and went on a rampage capturing every pirate on the island during 𝐵𝗫𝗵𝐷 arc. Knowing how cocky the majority of the pirates are, sooner or later one of them will do something that'll seriously annoy �K�ZARU, and at that point, every pirate in his vicinity is doomed. With his 𝗕𝗲𝗃𝗀 no Mi, �K�ZARU would quickly go from ship to ship and destroy even the large fleets all by himself. This unprecedented strength would quickly make �K�ZARU famous throughout the Grand Line, and everyone would know not to mess with him. It sounds a bit weird, but I think that he would be really similar to Mihawk, a strong guy who just minds his own business on his own territory and doesn't really involve himself with politics or stuff like that. And while we're talking about 𝗕�ZARU's similarities to Mihawk, it's also likely he would become a warlord. However, he wouldn't do this so he could commit crimes without having to worry about Marines, but more because he doesn't want to be bothered while traveling. At the end of the day, I just don't see 𝗕�ZARU having any ambitious goals or going out of his way to search for the One Piece, so he'd probably just retire from piracy after becoming an old man and live out his remaining years in peace, similar to Rayleigh. This was only the first out of 7 characters we're covering in this video, and some of them will be much stronger than 𝗕�ZARU. Anyway, I think we can all agree, 𝗕𝗓𝗄 just wouldn't fit as the next Pirate King. And there's someone else who's way more fitting for the role. Someone much freer. Of course, I'm talking about Monkey D. Garp. Being Luffy's grandpa, Garp shares the same easygoing attitude as him. Also, in one of the prototypes for the first chapter of One Piece, instead of Shanks, Garp is the famous pirate who inspires Luffy to go on his adventure. This means that even Oda, the creator of One Piece, thought Garp could make an excellent pirate. So what would this guy do if he switched jobs? Well, first of all, we can all agree that his pirate crew would look really similar to Luffy's. He would most likely only have a handful of crewmates who would all consider each other friends and would even die for one another. Now, since Bogart is Garp's right-hand man in the show, it's only natural that he would be the vice captain of Garp's crew and the man he trusts the most. Garp would gladly help anyone in need on his journeys and would prioritize the most fun path instead of the most optimal, boring one. However, one way he would differ from Luffy is that Garp really enjoys training wimps and turning them into capable fighters, as he did with Kobe and 𝐿𝐵𝐴 in the show. Based on this, we can assume that Garp would have a couple of youngsters on his crew at all times, similar to how Roger had Shanks and Buggy in his crew. He would constantly overtrain these poor youngsters, making them repeatedly punch the subscribe button with their bare hands, which you should also try by the way, and leaving them in dangerous areas to survive. But they would love and respect him regardless. Of course, his rivalry with Roger would still stand, and I can imagine the two fighting to death one day, them partying and drinking the next. Let's be honest, Garp always really respected Roger but just couldn't be friendly with him because he was a pirate, so now that they're both pirates, they can finally be buddies. Same as Roger, Garp would also want to find the legendary treasure, One Piece, but knowing his carefree attitude, he would often get distracted by random adventures and spend too much time having fun on various islands. So even in this timeline, I still believe Roger would be the one to eventually find the treasure, and he would probably tell Garp all about it, same as he did to Whitebeard in the original story. From this point on, Garp and his crew would sail the seas for many, many years, and the great pirate Garp would eventually die a piece of old age, surrounded by friends and companions. Okay, although Garp didn't become the king of the pirates, he at least had a fun journey with his friends, but we can't say the same for the next character on the list whose journey ended much more tragically. You see, Green Bull is one of the new admirals introduced after the time skip, and although we know very little about him, we know he really likes to idolize people and act like them. We've seen this in the show with his admiration towards the fleet admiral Sakazuki, with Green Bull even adopting a really similar justice motto as him. So if he was to become a pirate, I'm certain he would do something similar and idolize some famous evil pirate like Kaido or Big Mom. With this attitude, Green Bull would go around causing a bunch of trouble for everyone, destroying towns and maybe even whole islands in the process. In the anime, we also know that Green Bull likes to prove his strength to those he admires, which is why despite Sakazuki telling him not to, he went to Wano in order to capture Luffy, thinking Sakazuki would be pleased if he succeeds. He would be no different as a pirate, and would probably be the cockiest out of everyone on this list. He would create a crew full of people like him who think they can take down the absolute strongest in the world. But this is precisely the reason I don't believe his adventure would go the way he wants. You see, with this attitude, Green Bull would carelessly charge into an emperor's territory like Whole Cake Island, Wano, or maybe even some of the Whitebeard's territory. Of course, he wouldn't have any solid plans set in place and would just go to prove himself by killing someone strong. And as you can probably guess, he would be completely obliterated. I can only see 3 possible outcomes for Green Bull after this loss. He would either be dead, captured in Big Mom's book, or imprisoned in Kaido's prison on Wano. I think it's best for this guy to just stick to being a Marine. Now, although all the characters we covered so far had no intentions of actually becoming the pirates in the story, this next one actually did become a pirate. Needless to say, I'm talking about Aokiji, the new Titanic commander of the Blackbeard pirates. So, did you ever wonder how different his pirate career would turn out if he was a pirate from the very beginning? Well, firstly, he would be a bit weaker than in the original story, as he would never meet Garp and train with him. Of course, he would still become incredibly strong by training alone, but we can all agree that nothing can really replace Garp's unorthodox training methods. Another important thing is that 𝐕 wouldn't have survived the 𝐂𝐵𝐷𝐸 incident because there'd be no one to save her. I mean, I don't think I like this scenario so far. If Aokiji was a pirate, I believe he'd be laid back, not worrying about some race for an ancient treasure. He also wouldn't hurt innocent citizens or forcefully take any territories. He would just chill. Also, I think Aokiji would be the first character on the list who wouldn't have a single crewmate. For him, having a crew is just having people he has to worry about and protect, and that's not something he wants to do. Being alone also gives him the freedom to travel however and whenever he wants, so there's no one to scream at him for lazing around and sleeping all the time. On the rare instances that he does decide to wake up and travel, he would do it by freezing the water with his 𝐕𝐴𝐵𝐴 and riding his signature bicycle over it. No need for a fancy ship. Although Aokiji would be pretty strong, he could never become an emperor or have a high bounty. That's because the world government would never view him as a serious threat, since he doesn't cause any problems for them and he doesn't even have a crew to begin with. Due to his lack of any goal and crew, after a few years, I can totally see him joining someone else's pirate crew like he did in the original story. However, he wouldn't join just any crew. It has to be the one Aokiji agrees with, and of course they have to let him still be a free man without too many responsibilities. This could very well be Garp's crew, since they could probably get along as pirates the same way they did as Marines. Also, Garp obviously wouldn't be that strict about discipline, which is great for Aokiji. From here on, he would sail the seas along with Garp and would help him train the youngsters on the ship. There's still 3 incredibly strong Marines left to cover, and you won't believe how strong the last one would be as a pirate. Sengoku. Sengoku's a tough one to predict. His position as the fleet admiral forced him to listen to all orders from above, so we don't really know much about his personal views. One thing we know for sure is that he at least is not as rotten as some of the other people in the Navy. Since Sengoku was keen on adopting and training kids in the past, like Rocinante and X-Drake, we can expect that as a pirate, he would do something similar, just on a much bigger level since he wouldn't have to do it in secret anymore. Sengoku would adopt and raise kids he sees potential in, and would turn them into top-tier fighters. While everyone else we've covered so far would either have a small crew or no crew at all, Sengoku would actually have a giant fleet. It would partly be made out of the kids he's trained, but a big chunk would also be random pirates who would join him out of respect. Okay, but what would he actually do with this giant fleet? Well, Sengoku doesn't have any world domination goals or anything like that in mind. He'd just want to get to the One Piece just like everyone else. But he wouldn't rush it. I mean, his whole thing is that he's the strategist, so he would probably have a big step-by-step plan on how to locate all the poneglyphs, how to steal them, and so on. Discipline would be the key in this crew, and Sengoku would often punish people who don't listen to him or slack off. However, his crewmates would still respect him because they know that everything he does is for their own safety. Sengoku would value his men a lot and would always try to minimize his crew's deaths and injuries. He would be careful about who he sends to combat and would avoid any unnecessary disputes with Marines and other pirates. He would also be on good terms with most of the strongest pirates like Roger and Whitebeard, and although they wouldn't exactly be buddies, they wouldn't bother each other. Due to his mighty fleet and very good strategy, Sengoku and his crew would be one of the main players in the race for the One Piece, but would they actually manage to claim it before Roger? Well, no. You see, Roger has done a lot of stupid and not fully thought out things during his journey, like riding the knock-up stream to arrive on Skypiea or sneaking into Big Mom's territory to get a poneglyph. Given how tactical Sengoku is, it doesn't really seem likely that he would take all these risks, and would probably just think of other, safer ways to do these things. However, even though Roger would still become the Pirate King in this timeline, Sengoku would be remembered as one of the legends of the era, and who knows, he may even become the Emperor at some point. Before we explain how will Sakazuki, the strongest current Marine officer, fare as a pirate, let's first cover someone completely different. Someone who has absolutely no desire to achieve titles or find treasures. Fujitora. Although Fujitora may be the least scary out of the 3 admirals, he is by no means a weakling. We all know that Fujitora blinded himself because he couldn't stand looking at the evil anymore. Now, considering how much evil the world government does, it's not hard to imagine that in this fictional timeline, Fujitora would see something so bad that they did, which would eventually lead him to become a pirate to oppose the evil government. However, even after becoming a pirate, I believe he would still be one of the good guys and would try to use his influence as a pirate to make the world a better place. Actually, when you think about it, by not being a pawn to the Marines, he could probably do much more good than he currently can in the story. His goals as a pirate would be to completely change the current power system in the world and free people from the world government's control. Due to their similar goals, Fujitora would often work with Dragon in the Revolutionary Army, being one of their biggest allies. When he's not helping them, however, he would sail around the Grand Line, freeing islands that are controlled by evil people and protecting them from pirates. He would offer those people to join his crew, guaranteeing them protection as long as they stick to him, similar to what Shanks is doing with all those weak crews sailing with him. He would donate most of the money he steals from other pirates to the islands that need it the most, and would overall be well respected and a liked pirate. And finally, let's talk about a character you've all been waiting for, the current Fleet Admiral Akainu. As a pirate, Akainu would definitely be one of the worst pirates, maybe even the worst. He's already pretty violent as a Marine, so just imagine how troublesome he would be if he didn't have to listen to any orders. Now combine his unstable character with super destructive Magu no Mi, and you get an absolute monster of a pirate. Akainu would command a gigantic pirate ship and have a very large crew under his command. Judging by his character, he wouldn't consider his crewmates friends and would see them more as pawns that he can use to achieve his goals. It's likely that he would even kill his own men if they ever did something to displease him. Also, any pirate alliances are completely out of the question, as Akainu would rather die fighting than ally himself with another pirate. Same as all strong pirates, Akainu would have many territories under him that would, in return for his protection, be forced to give him large amounts of money every single month. Akainu would be one of the most feared pirate captains in the New World, annihilating smaller pirate crews he comes across or sparing them if they chose to work under him. Of course, he wouldn't only attack the weak pirates, but would also frequently fight other Marine admirals and emperors, easily matching their strength. And when most of his men die, he would just recruit new people from territories under his control, replenishing his forces over and over again. Now, you probably noticed that Akainu as a pirate would share a lot of similarities with Kaido, but what if I tell you that he would actually be way more dangerous than him for one simple reason? You see, unlike Kaido, Akainu wouldn't just sit on one island and slowly grow his army, and would instead be constantly fighting everyone around him, conquering even more territories and bringing terror everywhere he goes. Although Akainu and his pirate crew may seem unstoppable and strong enough to find the One Piece, this attitude would eventually lead to their downfall. You see, when you make the entire world your enemy and refuse to negotiate or back down, the world might just team up to take you down. I mean, just ask Rocks. He knows it all too well. In this scenario, it's most likely that a big alliance between pirates would eventually form, with the sole goal of defeating Akainu. Since he also enraged the Marines with his senseless destruction, they would also help the pirate alliance behind the scenes, providing them with weapons or money. Despite all of his power, there wouldn't be anything Akainu could do, and after a long battle, he would finally be killed by the pirates.
Thanks, Guy. I'll take it over from here, and let's continue with one of my personal favorites. All right, what would happen if the time skip never took place? What if the Straw Hat Pirates reunited after only 3 days as they originally planned? Would they still be able to achieve everything they did, or would something much darker occur? Well, for starters, they would obviously be much weaker than they were in the original story, and they would have considerably harder time in the new world. I know what many of you are saying now: the supernovas managed to survive in the new world just fine and become somewhat notorious pirates. Since Luffy was one of the strongest supernovas at that time, he should also survive the new world pretty easily, right? Well, no, that's completely wrong, and let's explain why. There is one important difference between Luffy and other supernovas. Can you guess what it is? If you said that Luffy and his crew consist of total idiots who don't have the slightest sense of danger and would attack anyone they want regardless of consequences, you'd be absolutely right. You see, even though the new world is the most dangerous sea, with good planning and organization, you'd be able to avoid all of the really strong enemies until you eventually get stronger. This is exactly what some of the supernovas did. Hawkins literally uses tarot cards to tell him the outcome of certain events. Law became a warlord, which made his journey a lot easier, and 𝐵𝗫 aligned himself with Big Mom. Can you imagine Luffy doing any of these things? Of course not. For example, take the 𝐵𝗫𝐴𝐵𝐴 archipelago arc. Here, Luffy punched a celestial dragon with completely no regard for consequences. An admiral is coming for me? Excellent, let him come. Of course, when Kizaru actually came, Luffy realized just how weak he really was against some of the world's most powerful fighters. If Luffy came across emperors in the show's early stages, he'd probably challenge them too. Thankfully, he didn't. Based on all of this, Luffy and the Straw Hats have absolutely no chance of surviving the new world. They may be able to leave Fishman Island alive, but as soon as they get to Punk Hazard and engage Caesar Clown, they sign sign their death sentence. There is no way Straw Hats can defeat Caesar without their time skip training. They couldn't even use hockey back then and were objectively much weaker. So unfortunately, Luffy and his crew would die during this arc. Before we explain what would happen if Gear 5 Luffy was at Marineford, let's first explain what would happen if Luffy was captured and sentenced to death by Marines. Okay, let me begin by saying that this would certainly start the biggest war ever, even bigger than Marineford was. Although capturing an emperor pirate like Luffy would be a dream of the world government, if they ever actually attempted to do so, it would backfire on them heavily. Here are two important things that Luffy's capture would trigger, and let me explain exactly what those are. Firstly, since there are many countries that Luffy liberated, this would probably make all of them leave the world government as a sign of rebellion. The government would have to send CPO or some other group to quell the revolt, but this would only worsen things as the other nations would see their true face. With this, it's possible that even more countries would quit the government, bringing the world into a state of chaos. But this is not even their biggest problem. Do you know how many people would attempt to save Luffy from the execution? Would you believe me if I told you it was easily over 100,000 people? Just think about it. Straw Hats and the entire Grand Fleet, Red Hair Pirates, the entire army of Alabasta, Bow Hancock and Kuja Pirates, Wano Samurai, remnants of Whitebeard Pirates, all of Fishmen, entire Galley Law and Frankie's family, the entire Revolutionary Army, and even Garp. This would surely be the biggest alliance of forces ever made. Although there are some notable Marines like Sengoku, Kizaru, and Akainu, they would be completely helpless. Even if they execute Luffy before the alliance comes, this would only make things worse for them, as it would be outright mayhem. In the end, assuming that all factions I mentioned can work together, the entire Marine force would be crushed. It's crazy to think that one man alone could unite all these people and overthrow the entire government. Way back at Marineford, Mihawk summarized this perfectly. It's not some sort of special power, but he has the ability to make allies of everyone he meets, and that is the most fearsome ability on the high seas. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for. What would happen if Gear 5 Luffy was at Marineford during Ace's execution? After awakening his devil fruit, Luffy became one of the strongest characters in the entire series. But imagine if he had these powers pre-time skip. How would he stack against some of the characters at Marineford? And most importantly, would he be able to save his brother, Ace? I will start by saying something shocking. I think Gear 5 Luffy is actually stronger than Whitebeard at Marineford. Think about it. Whitebeard was already old and sick at this point. He had to be connected to medical equipment at all times and had only a fraction of the power and endurance he once had. I am only mentioning this to demonstrate how influential Gear 5 Luffy would be in this fight. Okay, so the battle would start same as in the anime, but everything would change once Luffy falls from the sky and joins the fun. The first major change is that Luffy would immediately use Conqueror's Haki to eliminate all weaker opponents, so they wouldn't be in the way. Remember how admirals were toying with Luffy and not taking him seriously during this arc? Well, that wouldn't be the case this time, as admirals would definitely sense the threat Luffy is posing. So how would the battle play out? Well, I know many of you are thinking that Luffy will just go into God mode and wipe the floor with everyone, but let's be realistic here. Luffy is obviously incredibly strong, but he would be up against 3 admirals, warlords, and even Garp and Sengoku. If you want to stay alive, these are definitely not the enemies you underestimate. Anyway, Whitebeard would also recognize Luffy's strength, and the two would assist each other. Firstly, Whitebeard's commanders should be strong enough to hold off some of the warlords and possibly one of the admirals. The only warlord that would cause some problems here is Mihawk. Still, considering that he wasn't really interested in fighting that much during this arc, he probably wouldn't go out of his way to stop Luffy or Whitebeard. Next, Whitebeard and Marco should easily hold the remaining 2 admirals and keep them busy. This would mean that Luffy's path would be cleared, and he'd head straight for Ace. His first obstacle would be Garp, and as was already implied in the show, Garp can't bring himself to seriously punch Luffy, so he'd probably just let him pass. The only one left now is Sengoku, and this time around, he'd be much more serious and fight against Luffy with all he has. So, can Luffy defeat him? Well, don't forget that Sengoku is really old, 77 years to be exact. He is not as fearsome as he used to be, and since he is a fleet admiral, he probably didn't see much action in quite some time. Based on this, Luffy should be able to at least injure him enough to escape with Ace, but not without some serious injuries. While this is happening, Whitebeard would be stabbed by Squard, which puts him and his crew at a disadvantage. Also, the entire Blackbeard's crew will arrive to ambush Whitebeard, and as in the original version, they will manage to kill him. Enraged, Luffy would engage admirals and heavily injure them, but also sustain further wounds himself. By the time Shanks arrives, both sides would be absolutely worn out, unable to continue fighting, and the war would end with Ace alive. It's a shame that this scenario didn't actually happen. Marineford arc would be so much more epic! But for this next scenario, let's cover something a bit different. What if all Straw Hats fought Gear 5 Luffy together? Would they be able to defeat him, or would he absolutely crush them? Well, to better understand this, let's quickly see how each member would fare against their captain in battle. Is there any form of Luffy they can defeat individually, and is there any member that can defeat Gear 4 or Gear 5 Luffy? For example, Usopp has already fought Luffy once at Water 7, and we all know how that went for Straw Hat Sniper. Based on this, it's clear that pre-time skip Usopp has no chance against Luffy. But what about after the time skip? Does Usopp have any chance then? Well, not really. Although Usopp got noticeably stronger after his training and added pop greens into his arsenal, he still has no real chance of contending with Luffy. If the two did actually battle, the only thing Usopp could do is keep his distance and try to hit him with sniper shots. However, Luffy's observation haki is way too advanced, and this wouldn't pose the slightest problem for him. You could argue that Usopp himself also has this type of haki, but to be honest, I don't see a way that would help him in this matchup. I'll go as far as to say that current Usopp can't even defeat pre-time skip Gear 2 Luffy. I may be underestimating Usopp a bit here, but considering that Luffy managed to defeat Lueno and contend with Rob Lucci in this form, I just can't imagine Usopp defeating him. Luffy versus Chopper. Although it may not seem like it, Chopper has achieved some notable feats pre-time skip, like defeating Gedatsu and CP9 agent Kumadori. However, after the time skip, he suffered the same fate as Usopp, very slight power improvement and lagging behind his fellow crewmates. On top of that, the Straw Hat's doctor has zero understanding of haki, and there are no signs that he will learn it anytime soon. The only actual threat to Luffy would be his strongest transformation, Monster Point. But even then, can he do anything against his captain? Well, if it's pre-time skip Luffy and he isn't using any gears, sure, I think he'd be able to defeat him. Nevertheless, if Luffy activates Gear 2, there is just no way Chopper could keep up with its speed. He'd be crushed in no time. Due to his endurance, he'd definitely be able to stay alive a bit longer than Usopp, but at the end of the day, he should just stick to being a doctor. Although Chopper couldn't contend with Luffy on his own, he'll definitely be much more useful at the end of the video when all Straw Hats engage Luffy together. Luffy versus Brook. Here is when things start to get interesting. When Brook was initially introduced, it seemed like he was just a weird, funny guy who couldn't fight at all, but that was far from the truth. Brook turned out to be a very experienced and strong swordsman. Well, not as strong as some of the legend of the series, but no small fry either. Most importantly, he is really experienced, as he was a pirate even before Gold D. Roger went out to the sea. So, is there any form of Luffy he can defeat? Well, due to his incredible speed, I think he would actually be the first character on this list to hold his own against Luffy's pre-time skip transformations. Now, this doesn't mean he'll win for sure, but he definitely put up a great fight and survived far longer than the other characters so far. Of course, it goes without saying that Gear 4 Luffy would crush him in seconds. Luffy versus Nami. Nami being this high on this list might seem unrealistic, but if you really think about it, she has actually gotten pretty powerful recently. After the time skip, her main weapon, 𝐶𝐿IMA-TACT, got some very powerful upgrades, and recently it even became sentient, thanks to Zeus fusing with it and amplifying its power. Nami's greatest achievement is bringing down Ulti, a beast pirate worth 400 million bellies, proving just how strong she really became. So, how would she fare against Luffy? Well, due to everything I mentioned so far, she should be able to defeat Luffy's pre-time skip gear transformations. However, if you still don't believe this, just remember that Nami also knows Luffy's personality, and since he is not really the smartest guy out there, she'd probably manage to manipulate him to some extent and eventually defeat him. When it comes to Luffy's more powerful transformations, she stands absolutely no chance against them. Gear 4 and Gear 5 Luffy could defeat her in hundreds of ways, but the most interesting one would definitely be just to catch her Thunderbolt mid-flight and throw it back at her, same as he did against Kaido. Okay, with Nami covered, we finally got to some of the strongest crew members, and it will be very interesting to see how they would stack against Luffy. Luffy versus Franky. The shipwright of the crew, Franky, spent the time skip researching and improving his inventions using schematics obtained from an old lab of Dr. Vegapunk. However, based on everything he has done since the time skip, he doesn't seem to have acquired any groundbreaking powers. Franky is far more useful in a group battle as he can support his crewmates with his inventions, and if he had to fight Luffy on his own, it wouldn't be a great experience for him. Using General Franky to protect himself and radical beams to attack from a long range, Franky should be able to defeat Luffy's weaker forms. However, same as the other characters so far, he is not nearly strong enough to take on Gear 4 in battle. If Luffy was to fight him seriously, Franky would be crushed. Luffy versus Robin. Robin's current bounty is almost 1 billion bellies, and while that's mostly due to her knowledge about poneglyphs, she isn't weak by any means.
This is especially true after Wano,
where she got a very strong power-up called 𝐷𝗉𝐴, which enabled her to defeat Black Maria, who had a bounty of 480 million bellies. Same as Frankie, Robin should be able to defeat any pre-time skip version of Luffy relatively easily. In a battle against Gear 4 Luffy, she could briefly hold him down with multiple arms using her Devil Fruit and then slam him with the Fishman Karate technique. Admittedly, it would be quite difficult to subdue this version of Luffy, but if she ambushes him with enough arms, she should be able to land a few hits on him. It was revealed that she also knows how to create clones of herself, which would serve as a good way to distract Luffy. However, even with all of this, Robin doesn't really have a way to keep Luffy down permanently. So even if it takes him a bit more time, he'll easily defeat her. What's interesting is that a lot of Robin's abilities work really well in combination with other Straw Hats, so it'll surely be incredible to see how she will use them at the end of the video when all Straw Hats engage Gear 5 Luffy together. Luffy versus Jinbei. Jinbei is a master of Fishman Karate, a former warlord and the Knight of the Sea. Can he be the first character on the list to finally defeat Gear 4 Luffy? Despite not possessing any Devil Fruit powers, it's important to mention that Jinbei is the first character so far to have 2 types of haki, armament and observation, which would greatly help him in his battle against Gear 4 Luffy. Furthermore, both of them have incredible endurance, with Luffy fighting Karakuri for 12 hours and Jinbei fighting Ace for 5 days straight. Based on this, it would surely be a long battle, with many injuries on both sides. But who wins at the end? Well, let's look at it like this. Luffy defeated Doflamingo in this form. Do you really think Jinbei would be able to do the same? Obviously not, and this is the main reason why I think Luffy would win at the end, but it definitely wouldn't be easy. Before we explain how Luffy's right-hand man would fare against him, let's first cover a battle between Luffy and Sanji. Sanji is Luffy's left-hand man, and the future Pirate King definitely shouldn't take this fight lightly. You all know how strong Sanji is, especially after Wano, where he learned his new powerful ability called Ifrit Jambe. He also managed to defeat Queen, one of the strongest members of the Beast Pirates, with a bounty of over 1 billion bellies. Due to his offensive fighting style, Sanji would engage Luffy immediately and start dealing serious damage with his kicks. Also, since Sanji is arguably the fastest crew member, Gear 4 Luffy would have a very hard time dodging his attacks. Luffy would most likely have to fight in his Boundman variation in order to survive some of Sanji's powerful kicks. One more important thing about the 4th gear is that it significantly affects Luffy's body. This means that if Sanji can stay alive until Luffy reaches his limit, he could easily finish him off since Luffy would be completely defenseless. So, can Sanji pull it off? Is he the first Straw Hat to defeat Gear 4 Luffy? Yes! I think Sanji could achieve this with mid to high difficulty, but unfortunately, that's exactly where Sanji's luck ends, as when Luffy enters his newest Gear 5 form, he would absolutely crush him. There is no way Sanji can even remotely contend with this beast. He would lose in mere minutes. Luffy versus Zoro. Zoro is, without a doubt, the second strongest member of the Straw Hat crew. He is also the only character in the crew besides Luffy to have all 3 types of haki. Zoro did some incredible things in Wano, like blocking Emperor's combined attack, injuring Kaido, and even defeating King. He is surely the one who will give Luffy the absolute toughest fight so far, and there is one important reason for this. Since Zoro uses swords and cutting attacks to fight, he is Luffy's natural weakness. Using his 3 sword style, each of Zoro's attacks would be deadly for Luffy, and he'd have no other option than to dodge every single one. Undoubtedly, Zoro can defeat every single version of Luffy before Wano. This also includes Gear 4 Luffy, who, for the reasons we previously mentioned, shouldn't pose that much of a problem for current Zoro. So what about the Sun God Luffy? Can our favorite swordsman do anything against him? Well, yes and no. Firstly, it's important to mention that Luffy is still vulnerable to cutting attacks even in this godly form, and if Zoro can find some openings, he actually has a good chance of dealing some damage to him. However, even if Zoro has a few things going his way in this fight, Luffy's abilities in this form are just too ridiculous for our swordsman to handle. Luffy wins this low to mid difficulty, but definitely not without some injuries. Luffy versus the Straw Hats. Alright, as you've seen so far, no single crew member has a chance of defeating Luffy, but what if all of them attacked Gear 5 Luffy together? Who would be victorious in this epic matchup? The closest to a full team up against one individual the Straw Hats ever had was against Oars on Thriller Bark. Although each member was considerably weaker than they currently are, this team up showcased their incredible teamwork and chemistry. Something that would further help them in this fight is the fact they are all familiar with most of Luffy's fighting styles, meaning they could plan and prepare a strategy beforehand. Most of you probably forgot about this, but Straw Hats have one technique that can put Gear 5 Luffy down in a matter of seconds. Which one, you may ask? Giant Robot Big Emperor. Of course, this all depends on if Robin will go through with it this time. Okay, in all seriousness, leading the charge would obviously be Zoro, Sanji, and Jinbei. They would probably attack from 3 different angles to confuse Luffy and make it harder for him to dodge. Brook and Frankie could act similarly, but instead of close combat, they could use radical beam and chilling sword attacks and not give Luffy any time to rest. While all this is happening, Nami, Chopper, and Robin will watch closely and try to spot some of Luffy's weak points. In case Luffy transforms into a giant using his new abilities, Monster Point Chopper, General Frankie and Robin's gigantic Fleur should be able to hold him down. Okay, so the best contender to land the finishing blow on Luffy would obviously be Zoro, since, as we already mentioned, his fighting style is really good against Luffy's fruit. However, this won't be easy, and it would require Straw Hats to weaken Luffy significantly and hold him down for at least a few seconds. This would make an opening for Zoro to land a precise finishing strike with his new sword, Enma. So, can they manage to pull this off? Well, based on everything these characters achieved throughout the show, I am certain they would manage to do it. Some of the weaker members may lose their life in the process, but in the end, Luffy would be defeated by his crew, and there is not much he can do to avoid it. Only 5 more scenarios are left, and let's continue with what would have happened if Kizaru went to Wano. Before we can talk about what would happen in Wano if Kizaru arrived, we first need to understand one thing. Although Kizaru is incredibly strong, he wouldn't go to the land of samurai alone. He would most likely come with his entire fleet, including many warships, Sentomaru, and even pacifistas, similar to how he recently appeared in the Egghead Island arc. Considering that the regular beast pirates aren't that strong, Sentomaru and other soldiers should be able to easily take care of them, allowing the Admiral to go straight to action and engage more important targets. The first people Kizaru meets would be Ulti, Usopp, Page 1, and Nami. Given his personality, I don't think Kizaru would bother battling with them. It's more likely that he will just ask them where their captains are, as he came here to battle strong guys. While Kizaru is on his way toward Luffy and Kaido, the situation in Onigashima is far more chaotic than in the original story, as there would now be 3 factions fighting: Marines, Samurai, and Beast Pirates. It would be a free-for-all mayhem with many casualties on all sides. Kizaru would eventually reach a higher floor and finally find someone he respects, Marco the Phoenix. Kizaru's appearance on this floor would add a lot of pressure, as Chopper is still trying to figure out a cure to the Oni virus that Queen had let loose on that floor. Marco would be shocked seeing Kizaru there and would immediately want to attack him for what he did to Whitebeard. However, the one who will be the voice of reason here is Chopper, who would beg Marco not to attack him, as they have more important things to worry about now. Kizaru would be disappointed but continue climbing, letting Marco know he would return for him. Now, depending on when Kizaru actually gets there, the situation on the rooftop can be very different. To simplify things a bit here, I'll say that Kizaru will arrive in the middle of the battle against Luffy and Kaido when everyone else has already moved from the roof. At this point, I think it's likely that Kizaru would play a similar role CP0 Agent played and severely damage Luffy from behind with one of his laser shots. You may think that Luffy would manage to dodge a shot like this, but you need to remember that at this point, he was really tired and almost completely out of energy. Even the CP0 agent in the original version managed to surprise him, so Kizaru would surely be able to do the same. This would enrage Kaido, as he wanted to defeat Luffy by himself. He would transform into his dragon form and rush towards the Admiral. Kizaru and Kaido would engage in a fierce battle that would completely shake the whole island. As all this is happening, Luffy would eventually regain consciousness and awaken his Gear 5 form due to his resolve to bring down Kaido. He would quickly join the fight, showcasing his new abilities as he punches Kizaru away using his giant form. Admiral would begin to get overwhelmed with both Kaido and Luffy now attacking him. They obviously didn't agree to fight Kizaru together, but given the situation, they would realize that it's in their best interest to get him out of there before they can properly finish their fight. With this unexpected development, it's most likely that Akainu would call immediate retreat of all Marines, as the situation got completely out of control. With him gone, Kaido and Luffy would be able to continue their battle, and Luffy would eventually come out on top, just as in the original story. Looks like Akainu was right not to let him go to Wano after all. Okay, that last scenario was really interesting, but let's cover a bit darker one now. What would happen if Luffy was never born? What would happen to the One Piece world and other characters? Well, what if I tell you that most of the Straw Hats would end up dead? Let's go through them one by one and see exactly what would happen. If Luffy never embarked on his journey, Morgan's tyrannical rule in Shell's Town would continue, and Zoro would get executed tied to a pole without ever becoming a pirate. When it comes to Nami, you'd probably think that she'll continue to serve under Arlong, but that's not really what would happen. Remember the first time Luffy and Nami met? It was in Orange Town when Luffy fell from the sky and helped her escape from Buggy's crew. Since Luffy isn't there to help her in this version, it's most likely that Nami would get captured by pirates and probably killed by Buggy for stealing. In the Syrup Village, nobody would believe Usopp that Captain Kuro wants to kill Kaya and inherit her fortune, and he would probably die trying to protect her from pirates. The events of Barati would also change greatly, with Mihawk killing Don Krieg pirates and saving the cooks. I don't think Mihawk would have any reason to harm Sanji or the others working there, so Sanji would stay alive but would never go out to the sea to achieve his dream. Luffy would also never visit Drum Island, so Wapol would probably kill Chopper and Dr. 𝗕𝗲 for refusing to leave his castle. Without Luffy to stop Crocodile, Robin would still serve under him in Alabasta, and after lying to him about what's written on the poneglyph, he would kill her without hesitation. Also, without Luffy's help, Jinbei would still be stuck in Impel Down and probably be executed shortly after Ace. Brook wouldn't be able to retrieve his shadow on his own and would probably be captured by Ryuma and imprisoned on Thriller Bark. However, by far the worst thing that would happen in this version of the story is the world government imprisoning Frankie and getting their hands on blueprints for one of the ancient weapons, Pluton. Although we still don't know exactly what Pluton is, one thing that's for sure is that it has immense destructive capabilities, and if it falls into the government's hands, no one would ever be able to oppose them. It's also important to mention that Luffy liberated many islands like Konomi Islands, Drum Island, Alabasta, Skypiea, Dressrosa, and even Wano. Without him, these islands would still be ruled by evil pirates, and countless people would lose their lives. Man, if Luffy was never born, the story would be so much sadder. Did you ever wonder what would have happened if Garp raised Luffy to become a Marine? Could he become strong enough to achieve the Admiral status? And what would happen to all the islands Straw Hats visited? Well, for starters, we can assume that Luffy's childhood would play out pretty much the same. This means that he would still be raised by Dadan in Fuchsia Village and eat the Gomu Gomu Nomi. The key difference here is that Luffy wouldn't be interested in becoming a pirate and would instead dream of becoming a great Marine, just like his grandfather. Considering Luffy wants to be a Marine now, Garp would visit the village more frequently in order to train him and prepare him for the tough road ahead. His training would go similarly to the original, with Garp putting Luffy in dangerous situations in order for him to develop crucial skills for survival. Also, it's likely that Garp would teach him the basics of Haki as well, as that's pretty much required of every strong Marine. By the time Luffy turned 17, he would already be a capable fighter, much stronger than when he set out to the sea in the original story. It's also during this time that Garp would deem Luffy ready and would take him out to the sea for the first time. Although Luffy's job would mostly be to adjust the sails and clean up the ship, he would be thrilled to finally sail the ocean. As soon as they set sail, Garp would give Luffy his official Marine uniform. Luffy being Luffy would obviously hate it at first, as it isn't comfortable as his regular clothes, but he would eventually come to enjoy wearing it. In addition to his usual chores on the ship, Luffy would also be put through rigorous exercise routines every single day in order to get stronger. And I don't mean just regular training routines that other Marines do, I mean Garp's version of training, which is way more intense and rigorous. Soon after beginning his adventure, Luffy would encounter his first threat, Alvida. I imagine Garp wouldn't want to wake up from his nap in order to fight such a weak pirate, so he would just tell Luffy to handle her himself and to leave him alone. This would be the first time Marine Luffy would showcase everything he has learned and swiftly knock out the pirate with one devastating punch. After he takes Alvida out, Luffy would notice a cabin boy hiding under the desk. They'd bond over their shared experiences as cabin boys, and Luffy would ask 𝐾𝐽 to join their Marine squad. Although Garp wouldn't be too happy about it, he would see something in 𝐾𝐽 and would decide to let him tag along. After boarding Garp's ship, the crew would make its way to Shellstown to drop off their prisoners and have a chat with the captain in charge of the area. Once they get there, they would see a man tied to a post waiting to get executed. After they learn about Zoro and why he is tied there, Luffy would urge Garp to do something about it. Considering Garp is the Vice Admiral, Captain Morgan would have to obey his orders and immediately release Zoro. Now, although it would be great to imagine how Zoro may join the Marines at this moment and fight alongside Luffy, I don't think that's realistic. What is realistic, though, is you hitting that subscribe button, which would really help the channel out. Thanks. Anyway, Zoro is a pirate hunter and has no interest in serving the government. This is why he would most likely just leave the base and continue his business as usual in the East Blue. Continuing their journey, the group would most likely come across Orange Town and help the local population get rid of the Buggy Pirates. Luffy might even meet Nami here for a brief moment, although they wouldn't really pay attention to each other. The next destination in the original story was Syrup Village. However, in this scenario, Luffy has no real reason to go there. Considering nobody knows about Captain 𝗕𝐲 being alive, it's likely that the crew would just skip this island, leaving Usopp to fend for himself and most likely die protecting Kaya. Okay, that's unfortunate. But what about Sanji? What would happen to him? Well, although Luffy, Kobe, and Garp have no real reason to stop at Barati either, it'll actually turn out good for Sanji, considering that Mihawk would soon be arriving to dispatch of Krieg pirates. It won't be long before the crew finally arrives at Loguetown. Here, Garp would use the opportunity to catch up with Smoker, while Luffy and Kobe would get a chance to meet another great Marine worth respecting. Now from here on, there wouldn't be much for Luffy and Kobe to do, so it's most likely that Garp would take them to Marineford in order to train and get stronger. During their time at Marineford, both Luffy and Kobe would significantly improve their skills, learning Rokushiki, a special martial arts style utilized by CP9 members. It's also during this time that they would meet many strong Marines. With some of them, they would become great friends, but with some of them, well, let's just say they wouldn't get along very well. Anyways, after some time, Aokiji would inform Garp about Crocodile and how they need to do something about him as he is completely out of control. Remember, the Marines already planned on capturing Crocodile in the original story. It's just that Luffy defeated him first so they didn't have to act. This is why we can assume that in this version, Marines would send a special team to Alabasta in order to finally dispose of him. Garp would see this as a perfect opportunity for Luffy and Kobe to test their skills and would send them to Alabasta along with Smoker and Hina. After arriving on the island, the group would confront Crocodile directly at his casino. Although Crocodile wouldn't go down without a fight, Luffy is far stronger in this version of the story and even knows Haki. This is why I believe that taking down Crocodile would pose no real problem to him and he'd easily capture him. Later, the group would work with Princess Vivi and King Cobra to find and apprehend the rest of Baroque Works members and stop the civil war within the country. Along the way, they would also capture Nico Robin, a criminal wanted by the government ever since she was a kid. Although Luffy is a Marine now and has a duty to capture criminals, after listening to Robin's story and learning that she is not actually a bad person, Luffy would have a change of heart and let her escape. Smoker would know that Luffy let her escape on purpose, but would decide to let it slide, as he knows Luffy had the best intentions in his heart. News of Crocodile's defeat and Luffy's role in it would quickly spread to the higher-ups, and he would soon get promoted to captain. After returning to Marineford, Garp would be proud of Luffy's achievements and would even introduce him to his friend, the Fleet Admiral Sengoku. From here on, we can assume that Luffy would be sent on various missions for the world government, mostly commanding small teams of Marines in order to protect certain islands or capture pirates. Whenever he had some free time, he would continue his training with Garp and would eventually become a master of Haki, even unlocking the Conquerors. And although everything is going well for Luffy so far, his world will soon be turned upside down. You see, it's around this time that news of Ace's capture would reach Marineford. Same as in the original, the world government would issue an order to have him executed, which would leave both Garp and Luffy in shock. Luffy would immediately ask to go to Impel Down to see him, but the world government wouldn't allow it. He would be outraged by this, but Garp would quickly calm him down and ask him not to do anything stupid that he'll regret. A few days later, Ace would finally arrive at Marineford for his execution, and as soon as Luffy lays his eyes on him, he'd burst into tears. In a matter of minutes, Ace would find himself on the execution platform as the Whitebeard pirates close in on the horizon. Soon after the battle starts, Sengoku would order Ace's execution to commence. Although Luffy initially thought he'd be able to keep his emotions in check, after the execution starts, he'd disregard all orders and jump towards Ace in order to save him. However, just as he would jump, he'd sense a strong force holding him down. Garp, with tears in his eyes, would hold Luffy down, begging him not to intervene. It's at that moment that two swords would pierce through Ace's chest, executing him. Ace's death would spark Whitebeard's rage, and a grand battle would ensue where Luffy would have to go head-to-head against Ace's allies. The loyalty of Whitebeard pirates towards their crewmates would shock Luffy, and he would come to greatly respect them. Despite that, that, he would still carry out his duties and would successfully take out some big members of Whitebeard's massive fleet. We can assume that the rest of the war would play out the same, with Whitebeard eventually dying and Blackbeard stealing his devil fruit. The only difference here is that Luffy would most likely be the one to yell to his fellow Marines to stop this senseless war instead of Kobe. Despite winning the battle, this war would make Luffy realize that not all Marines are good guys, and that some of them, like Akainu, are way more ruthless than they need to be. This would make him question the entire organization and wonder if they are doing any good at all. Garp would later tell Luffy about Sword, a secret Marine force consisting of Marines who operate freely and can choose what they want to do even if it goes against the government's orders. Considering Luffy's character, I think becoming a part of Sword just makes sense, as he would be able to do much more good than he ever could do as a regular Marine. After some time has passed, the word of 𝐕𝐲𝐴mingo's Coliseum tournament would get out, and the government would send Fujitora along with a team of Marines in order to capture some pirates and make sure everything goes smoothly. Luffy would also be on that team, and together with Fujitora, he would set sail to Dressrosa. As soon as they get there, the duo would realize that the tournament's main prize is the Mera Mera no Mi. Considering this was Ace's devil fruit, Luffy would ask Fujitora to enter the tournament in order to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. The Admiral would allow it, and just like in the main story, Luffy would enter the tournament and start destroying the competition. Along the way, he would also meet with Sabo and eventually let him take the devil fruit for himself. While in the Coliseum, both Luffy and Sabo would sense that something weird is going on and would notice that some of the contestants are missing. It's also possible that Luffy would stumble upon Kiros here, who would tell him exactly what's going on and that 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo is responsible for turning contestants into toys. Luffy would instantly relay this information to Fujitora, and although the Admiral would be reluctant to do anything about 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo since he is a warlord, after listening to everything 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo has done, I believe he would eventually agree to do it. Together, Luffy and Fujitora would lead Marines to the underground weapons facility and would liberate the people of Dressrosa along with the imprisoned Tontada slaves. The Tontadas will then aid the Marines alongside the Riku army to destroy the Smile factory in Dressrosa and put an end to 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo's operation for good. After a few intense battles, Luffy would soon come face to face against 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo, while Fujitora would work on slowing down the birdcage in order to protect the citizens. With his abilities put to the real test, Luffy would greatly struggle against 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo, but in the heat of the battle, he would eventually unlock Gear 4 and finally take the warlord down. In the aftermath, Luffy would thank Fujitora for his help and agree with the Admiral's wishes to convince the world government to finally dissolve the warlord system for good, as the warlords are doing way more harm than good. While investigating 𝐕𝐴mingo's businesses, Marines would find evidence of illegal experiments being conducted on Punk Hazard and would immediately inform Luffy and Fujitora about it. Parting ways with Fujitora, Luffy and the big team of Marines would set sail for Punk Hazard and eventually uncover the secret lab run by Caesar Clown. After confronting Caesar, Luffy would eventually defeat him and shut down the experiments. He would also rescue the gigantified children and accompany them to the nearest Marine base. After capturing both 𝐵𝐸𝐴mingo and Caesar, Luffy would return to Marineford as a hero. Even the world government higher-ups would acknowledge his achievements and promote him to Vice Admiral. Back at the base, Garp would ask Luffy to go to Fishman Island with him in order to convince his old friend Neptune to take part in this year's reverie. Once they arrive at Fishman Island, they would learn about a coup Hody Jones is planning. But let's be honest, this guy was a pushover even in the main story, and considering Luffy is a seasoned Marine now, he'd wipe the floor with him. To thank him for his protection, the royal family would ask Luffy to be their guest in the royal palace, and he would stay there until the reverie. At Marijoa, Luffy would meet with Green Bull and Fujitora, and together they would discuss what Fujitora is going to say to the rulers of the world about the warlord situation. However, just like in the canon story, their talks would be quickly interrupted by the sudden attack of the Revolutionary Army. Fighting alongside the two admirals and the rest of his fellow Marines, Luffy would help fend off the attack. Also, it's likely that he would come face to face with Sabo at some point, and may even briefly fight him. After Marioa is successfully defended, Luffy and the rest of the Sword members would be contacted by X-Drake to discuss infiltrating Kaido's forces. After some discussion, I believe Luffy would volunteer to go undercover as a spy, along with X-Drake, in order to learn as much as possible about Wano and what Kaido is doing there. After infiltrating Beast Pirates' forces, the pair would meet at the Flower Capital in order to discuss Kaido's global arms trade. While in Wano, Luffy would also be horrified by the huge weapon factories and the miserable conditions the people are forced to live through. Although Luffy would want to do something about it, considering he is a Marine now, he isn't allowed to mess with Emperors of the Sea. Even if he disobeyed orders and tried to take down Kaido, he wouldn't have any support from the Marines, and attacking Kaido's crew on his own would be a death sentence. So, after Kaido's deal with CP0 goes sour, it's most likely that Luffy would return to Marineford, as realistically, there's nothing he can do about the Wano situation. This also unfortunately means that Luffy wouldn't awaken Gear 5 during this time, as his battle against Kaido never happened. Soon after returning from Wano, Luffy and the other sword members would be informed that Koby has been kidnapped by the Blackbeard pirates while on a mission. Enraged by this, both Luffy and Garp would immediately gather all sword members in order to plan the rescue operation. Same as in the original story, Garp would make his interest on Hachinosu, shaking the entire island with his monstrous haki. Luffy and the other sword members would immediately take advantage of the commotion in order to release Koby and bring him to safety. Once Koby is safe, Luffy would rush towards Garp in order to help him in his battle against Aokiji and other Blackbeard commanders. Although Luffy being here would definitely make the situation better than in the original story, considering he never awakened Gear 5, there wouldn't be much he could do against the combined efforts of Blackbeard's commanders. At some point, Garp would realize this and command Luffy to escape the island while he fends off the attackers. Luffy would obviously be against leaving his grandpa like this, but Garp would yell at Luffy, telling him that he and the rest of the sword are the future of the Marines and that they must survive. With tears going down his face, Luffy would finally listen and evacuate with the rest of the sword. Immediately after returning to Marineford, Luffy would beg other admirals to do something in order to save Garp, but the world government would deem it too risky and wouldn't want to start an all-out battle against an emperor like Blackbeard. Although disappointed, Luffy would understand why it has to be this way and would focus all of his anger on training even harder than before in order to honor his grandpa's wishes to become the future of the Marines. In the time that follows, Luffy would get sent on countless missions in order to keep the world safe and would work with his allies from Sword to do riskier things that the world government wouldn't necessarily approve. During his adventures, he would often clash with the members of the Revolutionary Army, although with time, he would become understanding of their cause and would eventually realize that they aren't the bad guys the government is making them out to be. By the time Luffy is in his mid-20s, he would be considered one of the strongest Marines and would earn a lot of praise as a hero from people all over the world, same as his grandfather. He would become an absolute beast that would strike fear into the hearts of pirates. Eventually down the road, he would be offered to become an admiral, a position he would gladly accept with a goal to reform the entire organization from the inside. He may even unlock Gear 5 at some point while fighting against emperors of the sea, and would overall work to realize his dreams of changing the world for the better. Before we cover what would have happened if Shanks allowed Luffy to join his crew, let's first quickly cover what would happen if current Zoro fought Mihawk at Baratie. Zoro's encounter with Mihawk at Baratie was one he was definitely not prepared for. At that point in the story, Zoro was very naive, thinking he was strong, without even knowing essential abilities like Haki. He was quickly humiliated by Mihawk, which made him realize just how weak he really is. However, since then, over 1,000 chapters have passed, and with each one, Zoro keeps getting stronger and stronger. So what if current Zoro with all his current abilities and powers was fighting Mihawk at Baratie? What would happen in this scenario and who would win? Okay, so the battle would start out the same, with Mihawk arriving and Zoro challenging him to a duel. This time around, Mihawk would be able to sense that his opponent is really strong and would therefore take the battle more seriously. In the original story, he pulled out a small knife hidden in his necklace. However, this time, he would immediately pull out Yoro, his supreme grade sword. Mihawk would show respect to Zoro, acknowledging him as a worthwhile opponent, and would ask for his name. After Zoro gives it, Mihawk says, "Bring it on, Roronoa, fight me!" Zoro would angrily rush towards him, attacking him with his two-sword style, which Mihawk easily repels. "Is that all you got, Roronoa?" Zoro would smile and draw out Enma, his third sword. He'd proceed to use his advanced Conqueror's Haki and infuse it with it. The two would then start attacking each other again with their clash, causing the sky to split in two, similar to when Kaido and Big Mom fought. Everyone at the restaurant would turn their attention to the fight, not believing what they were seeing. I mean, just imagine Luffy seeing power like this at that point. His expression would be ridiculous. Anyway, Zoro would continue to attack using the techniques like Foxfire style and even Ashura, and Mihawk would keep defending without taking much damage. As the fight progresses, Mihawk shows greater skill and composure while Zoro struggles, but continues to attack him with everything he's got. Frustrated, Zoro would prepare his final attack that he used to defeat King 103 Mercy's Dragon Damnation. In response, Mihawk would prepare his strongest attack, which is Well, it doesn't really have a name since Mihawk doesn't name his attacks, but it will surely be incredibly strong. Anyway, the two swordsmen clash with everything they have, and as the dust clears, Mihawk is standing while Zoro is defeated on the floor. At that point, I don't think Mihawk would kill Zoro. He likes to have a rival, and it's more likely that he will encourage Zoro to get even stronger and find him again. Did you ever wonder what would have happened if Shanks accepted Luffy on his crew? How strong would Luffy become training under him? And what would happen to the other Straw Hats in this version? Well, for starters, we'll assume that Shanks accepted Luffy on his crew the moment he saw him eat the Gomu no Mi. This would make sense since Shanks would want to train Luffy himself in order for him to maximize his potential. This would also mean that Shanks wouldn't lose an arm to the Sea Beast, as he would already be gone before the bandits kidnapped Luffy. And although becoming a pirate was all Luffy ever wanted, as soon as he starts his journey with Shanks, he would realize that life on the sea isn't as fun as he imagined. Firstly, Shanks and the other officers will appoint Luffy to be the ship's cabin boy, meaning Luffy will spend most of his time washing the ship's floor, helping with the sails, and other random jobs. When a battle starts, Luffy wouldn't be allowed to fight, and would instead watch his crewmates swiftly deal with any threat. During his travels with the crew, Luffy would learn a lot about the world, other pirates, and the world government. This would make him far more knowledgeable than in the original story, as Garp didn't really teach him anything. One thing Luffy would notice is that none of the other crew members have any devil fruit abilities. This would intrigue him, and he would wonder how they are so strong without eating a devil fruit. So one day, Luffy would ask Shanks' right-hand man, Ben Beckman, about teaching him how to fight like they do, and how to be strong in order to protect his crewmates from any future threats. This is when Luffy would learn about Haki for the first time. Luffy would be amazed and would beg Ben to teach him. Ben would agree to teach Luffy the basics of this mysterious power, but with a catch. He would also want Luffy to learn about other things that have nothing to do with fighting, like navigation, strategy, or piloting a ship. Luffy's lessons would most likely include him doing his daily tasks blindfolded while dodging any incoming attacks from his teacher. He'd also occasionally get advice from several other crewmates to improve his skills. I imagine this would be pretty similar to how the Don Quixote family trained Law, with each member teaching Luffy a certain skill set that would be useful to him later on. Since we know that Luffy is incredibly talented when it comes to Haki, I expect him to pick up the basics pretty quickly, which would definitely impress everyone on the ship, especially Shanks. Around 3 years after joining the crew, Luffy would grow up to be a very capable fighter and would finally be allowed to participate in the crew's missions and assist in attacks. Against his enemies, Luffy would easily dodge the majority of attacks using observation Haki, and even if some attacks hit him, his armament Haki would nullify any serious damage. Luffy's progress would quickly impress everyone on the crew, and they would see immense potential in him. With his training paying off, Luffy would quickly become one of the heavy hitters of the crew and someone the other crewmates can rely on. By the time he is 17, this version of Luffy could successfully fend off the entire pirate crews on his own. It wouldn't matter if his opponents had Haki or Devil Fruit powers. Using his quick wits along with Gomu no Mi, he would get the job done. However, the best part about being on Shanks' crew for Luffy would be the constant partying. He loves bonding with his crew and would get excited about trying out all kinds of exotic food they'd find on their journey. It's during one of these celebrations that Shanks would reveal something very important to Luffy. He would tell him about 𝐿𝐷𝐴, the former king of the pirates. Since in this version, Luffy went out to the sea at a very young age, he probably wouldn't know how significant the Pirate King was. Luffy would most likely be shocked to hear that his captain was the cabin boy on one of the most influential pirate crews in history. Confident in himself, Luffy would proclaim that someday he's going to become the king of the pirates too. Although he'd be mocked and made into a laughingstock, Shanks would resonate with his determination and see a glint of his old captain inside him. Impressed, Shanks would entrust Luffy with his prized straw hat, albeit a lot later than he did in the original story. Upon learning about the Straw Hat's origin, Luffy's heart will begin to swell with feelings of admiration towards Shanks, and it'll push him to prove himself worthy of such a gift. And although everything is going great for Luffy right now, there's one huge problem with this scenario. You see, since Luffy is now with Shanks and didn't start his own crew, a lot of things in East Blue would be very different. For starters, Kobe would get abducted by the Alvida pirates and would have no way to escape and become a marine like he always wanted to be. Pirate hunter Roronoa Zoro would get executed for saving a little girl by Captain Morgan. Buggy pirates would terrorize the East Blue and catch Nami in the process before eventually giving her back to Arlong's crew. Usopp, now alone in the Syrup village, would get stuck in the middle of a pirate's conspiracy to kill his best friend Kaya and will probably die trying to defend her. Sanji and the Baratie also would meet their end after coming face to face with one of East Blue's most dangerous crews, the Krieg Pirates. So yeah, Luffy going with Shanks definitely led to some really bad stuff happening throughout East Blue. But what if I tell you that things would only get worse from there? You see, on the Grand Line, Wapol would continue to rule over the Drum Kingdom, meaning Chopper and Kureha would continue to live in hiding. All the way in Alabasta, Vivi wouldn't be able to stop Crocodile's plan on her own, which would lead to civil war in Alabasta and her death. Robin, who was hiding away from the world government, would keep working with shady organizations, all in order to survive and continue researching the world's history. Frankie would keep running a petty crime organization in Water 7 and would eventually get imprisoned by CP9. And lastly, Brook would forever drift aimlessly alone on a ship in the middle of the Florian Triangle. I think I liked the original story a bit better. Anyways, at this point, Luffy's been out at sea for around 7 years. During his travels with the crew, they would most likely pass by Reverse Mountain. That way, Shanks could pay a visit to one of his old crewmates, Crocus. This means that in this version of the story, Luffy would also meet Laboon, and might even paint Shanks' Jolly Roger on the whale in order to make it stop hurting itself. After this, the crew would visit one of the Sky Islands using the Knock-Up Stream, which would absolutely amaze Luffy. Eventually, the crew would arrive to 𝐵𝐲𝐻𝐵 Archipelago in order to get their ship coded. It's here that Luffy will learn about the true horrors of the world, especially once he sees the human auctioning house and the cruelty of the celestial dragons. Although Luffy would want to do something about it, Shanks would tell him that that's not a good idea and that he shouldn't draw too much attention to himself. On 𝐵𝐲𝐻𝐵, Luffy would also get the chance to meet Gold D. Roger's former right-hand man, Silver's Rayleigh. Rayleigh would take one look at Luffy and sense the same kind of energy his old captain had coming off of him. He would eventually ask Shanks about Luffy's devil fruit and teach the kid a couple of tricks to further improve his haki. As the crew enters the new world, things will immediately start to pick up. Firstly, Shanks would start giving Luffy more responsibilities and eventually sending him on his own missions. Most of these missions would include Luffy going to many kingdoms oppressed by the world government in order to gain information and eventually liberate them with the help of his crew. After successfully carrying out one of his longer missions, Luffy would come back and be surprised to learn that Shanks was busy dueling with Mihawk for fun while he was away. Remember, Shanks still has both of his arms in this scenario, meaning that Mihawk would be more than happy to battle with him. It's around this time that Shanks would learn from Mihawk that all warlords have been summoned to Marineford in order to make sure Ace's execution goes as planned. One thing to remember here is that in this scenario, Luffy went out to the sea much earlier than in the original story, and therefore, he never met Ace. Although Luffy would still be happy to help Shanks rescue him, Ace would be nothing more than the former Pirate King's son to Luffy. However, before they can get to Marineford, Luffy would have to face his toughest challenge so far. You see, as the crew is sailing to Marineford, they would come face to face against the Beast Pirates, same as they did in the original story. In order to stop Kaido from trying to kill Whitebeard, Shanks and his crew would have to engage them in battle. This would be the first time Luffy participated in the fight against another Emperor crew, and witnessing Kaido and Shanks going all out, he would soon realize that he still has much to learn. Nevertheless, he would still be an important part of this fight, and I can see him taking on someone like Queen or Jack in order to help the crew out. After some battling, Kaido's crew would eventually back down, and red-haired pirates would rush towards Marineford. However, just as in the original, they would fail to arrive on time, and Ace would get executed. The rest of the war would play out pretty much the same, with Shanks ending the battle and Blackbeard making his escape. One interesting thing that would happen this time around is that Luffy would see Garp for the first time after years on the sea. Garp obviously wouldn't be happy seeing Luffy and Shanks together, and would most likely yell at Shanks for turning his grandson into a pirate. Now, at this point in the original story, there was a time skip. However, this time, there's no need for Luffy to train for 2 years, as he has already learned haki from his crewmates. So, he would just continue to sail with the crew as usual. After some time, Luffy would get to meet one of the worst generation members in person, Eustace Kid, who would attack red-haired pirates in order order to kill Shanks. Kid and Luffy would eventually exchange a few blows here before Ben steps in and slices off Kid's arm, same as he did in the main story. It's also during this time that Law would meet his end somewhere on Dressrosa or Punk Hazard. The only reason he was able to take out 𝐕𝗲𝗏𝗡𝐺 was because of his alliance with Luffy, and since they didn't meet in this scenario, I just don't see a way Law would be able to do it on his own. After this, there wouldn't be any major events happening for some time, until the Red Hair Pirates decide to liberate Wano. Yeah, you heard that right. You see, in the original story, Shanks only sailed near Wano and decided not to enter the country. I believe he did this because he wanted to let Luffy fight Kaido and awaken his devil fruit in the process. Hence, he decided not to interfere. However, this time around, there would be no one else willing to liberate Wano, and I believe this would encourage Shanks to do it himself. On their way there, the Red Hair Pirates will gain intel on Wano's borders and manage to successfully infiltrate the country. Blending into the crowd, they'll slowly manage to find a few of the scabbards and would agree to work together with them in order to free the island from the Beast Pirates' tyranny. Following Shanks' orders, Luffy would travel to and infiltrate Udon in order to liberate the warriors inside so that they could fight for their own land as well. It's here that Luffy would meet Old Man Hyogoro, but this time around, there would be no need for him to learn advanced armament haki, as Shanks and other officers already taught him how to use it in preparation for this battle. I think Red Hair officers like Yasop, Lucky Roo, and Bonk Punch would be more than enough to take care of the Tobiropo, while Ben Beckman and the remainder of the officers would fight against King and Queen. This would leave Kaido's defenses wide open, and it would allow Shanks to duel him one-on-one. The two emperors would be evenly matched throughout the fight, and to be honest, we don't really know who would win in this matchup. Sure, Shanks is strong, but can he really defeat the world's strongest creature? Well, maybe he doesn't have to. You see, since Kaido's entire crew is busy fighting against Shanks' officers, it means that there would be no one to stop Luffy from coming to the battlefield and helping out his captain. With their combined power, Luffy and Shanks should be able to easily overpower Kaido and bring his reign to an end. Now with Wano under Shanks' protection, and with Kaido eliminated, the crew would set sail towards their next destination, the Island of Giants, 𝐿𝐵𝐻. As you know, 𝐿𝐵𝐻 is already Shanks' territory, and considering it's pretty close to Wano, it would make sense for the crew to visit there. Once there, Luffy would make friends with a bunch of giants and also learn about the sun god Nika from them. Around a couple of months after they reach 𝐿𝐵𝐻, the crew would hear about what happened to the Lulusia kingdom after the reverie. News will also spread about King Cobra's death at the hands of the Revolutionary Army's Chief of Staff, Sabo. These events will prompt Shanks to take the next step and finally go out and seek the One Piece. It's also important to mention that at this point, Luffy still has no clue about the true nature of his devil fruit, as Shanks didn't think it was time to tell him yet. Anyways, soon after this, Shanks would receive intel regarding the government's plot to kill Dr. Vegapunk. Now, in the original story, Shanks didn't go to Egghead personally to help him. However, he did send giant warrior pirates to help Luffy and his crew. Considering nobody is there to save Vegapunk in this scenario, it would make sense for Shanks and his crew to go there themselves. As soon as they close in on the island, their presence would raise the tension, and the Marines would wind up dispatching Admiral 𝐾𝐫𝐴 and 100 warships, just like in the original. Once they step foot on the island, the crew would finally get to see the infamous 𝐵𝐴Raphim in action. Luffy and the other officers would start engaging them in battle, while Shanks would take it upon himself to battle S-Hawk, sparring with him just as he did with Mihawk. Ben, being one of the smartest characters in the series, would quickly deduce York's role in the assassination plot and will coordinate an attack on her. While protecting Vegapunk, Luffy would get time to talk to him and would show off his devil fruit powers. This would shock Vegapunk, as he assumed that this legendary devil fruit was still in the world government's possession. This interaction would be enough for Vegapunk to finally explain to Luffy the true powers of his devil fruit and would also call him Joy Boy. However, considering Luffy didn't awaken his devil fruit in this scenario yet, he would simply shrug it off, as he wouldn't really have a clue what Vegapunk is talking about. While the rest of the Red Hair crew is busy with 𝐵𝐴Raphims, 𝐾𝐫𝐴 would make a sudden appearance and kick Luffy away before delivering a fatal blow to Vegapunk. Realizing he has failed his mission, and by extension Shanks, Luffy would vow to stop 𝐾𝐫𝐴 before he kills the rest of Vegapunk's satellites. While their duel is ongoing, everyone would feel a sudden shift in the aura and would notice the Gorosei arriving on the island. To level the playing field, using his overwhelming haki, Shanks would immediately knock out most of the Marines on the warships. At the same time, Luffy would go to investigate the eerie presence he sensed and would witness the entire red-haired crew trying their best to keep all enemies at bay. Out of nowhere, Luffy would get jumped by one of the Gorosei and get critically wounded. As he's lying on the ground barely alive, he would realize that he is still not strong enough to contend with some of the world's strongest fighters. After that grueling blow he took, Shanks and his crew would think that Luffy lost his life and would prepare to avenge their friend. While the red hair crew struggles to keep the Gorosei away from the Vegapunks, Luffy's heart would suddenly start beating again, but this time with the sound of the drums of liberation. This awakening would shock the Gorosei and stop them in their tracks. It's at that moment that Luffy would awaken as Joyboy, the incarnation of Sun God Nika, a warrior of liberation. Despite being unable to control his laughter and how serious he is, Luffy would use his new powers to aid Shanks in taking the Gorosei out one by one. Although their attacks would work, the Gorosei would instantly heal from any wounds inflicted on them. With cannon fire raining down upon the entire island because of a buster call, the crew would have no choice but to retreat for now. And since this is where the original story stops for now, it's going to mark the end of this video as well. However, if you like this one, you'll definitely like this one as well, where I created the worst character in One Piece. What are you waiting for? Click it!